The storm had been screaming against the relay for 6 hours when the apex predator stepped into the airlock and did not kill him. Tio Marsh knew it was there before he turned. He felt it the way a man feels a change in air pressure behind his ears, a weight, a stillness, the sudden absence of the small night things that usually scratched at the seams of the station. He set down the torque driver without hurrying. Hurrying was how the last 3 keepers of Meridian Relay had died. He had read their logs. He had buried what the world left of the third one under a cairn of ballast stone, and he had learned the lesson in those logs the way you learn a burn, once and forever. So he turned slowly, both hands open and empty, and looked up into 4 eyes the color of cooling iron. The thing filled the inner hatch. It stood taller at the shoulder than he stood on his feet, slate-and hide plated like a dry riverbed, each plate rimmed with a hairline of pale gristle. Its jaw was doubled, an outer set of blunt crushing plates, and behind them, a second mouth of needles that he could see moving when it breathed. The survey catalog on Meridian's dead data core had a designation for it, a string of numbers no one had ever survived long enough to make sound official. Tio just called them Vakar, because the storm made a sound like that when it came down off the northern shelf, and the name had stuck in his head the first night he saw one drag a full-grown storm elk off the causeway without slowing its stride. This one was female. He knew that now the way he knew a lot of things now from watching, from the long empty months of having nothing to study but the world that was supposed to eat him. Her crest was higher, her throat bladder wider, and there was gray in the plating around her eyes that the younger ones didn't have. He had seen her twice at a distance. He had never seen her closer than the far end of the causeway, and he had certainly never seen her in his airlock with the outer door still grinding open against the wind, acid rain hissing off her back and steaming where it touched the deck plating. She was carrying something in the needle jaw, carrying it carefully. "Easy," Tio said. His voice came out level, which surprised him. "I'm not going anywhere." The Vakar took one step onto the deck. The whole station felt it. Then she lowered her head, that enormous armored head, wider than his chest, and set the thing she was carrying down on the grating between his boots. It was a cub. Not a newborn, old enough to have plating of its own, though the plates were soft-edged and dull, more the color of wet clay than stone. It was the size of a large dog, and it was breathing wrong, shallow, quick, a wheeze at the bottom of each breath. One of its 4 hind limbs was folded at an angle limbs were not meant to fold. Along its flank, where the soft plating had torn, Tio could see a wound that had gone the gray-green of infection, and he could smell it from where he stood, rank and sweet under the ozone stink of the storm. He understood then why she had not killed him. She had tried everything a Vakar knew how to do. That was written all over her, in the raw patches on her own forelegs where she dug, in the way she stood over the cub with her weight canted forward, in the low grinding sound coming out of her throat bladder that was not a threat, and was not a call and was. He realized with something turning over in his chest, closer to the sound, a person makes at 3 in the morning at the edge of a bed they can't do anything about. She had carried her dying cub through an acid storm to the one thing on Threnody that built and mended, instead of tearing down. "Okay," Tio said softly. "Okay, let me see." He did not reach for the cub yet. He had learned that too. He crossed to the wall locker, moving in a slow diagonal that kept his hands where she could see them, and he warmed his palms over the little glow bar of the deck heater until the cold came out of them. Because the first time he'd ever touched one of Threnody's creatures with cold hands, it had recoiled like he'd struck it. And he'd spent a week understanding that on this world cold meant dead and dead meant meat, and no living thing on it wanted to be touched by something that felt like carrion. The matron watched him warm his hands. Her 4 eyes tracked the motion, and the grinding in her throat dropped half a register. Then he knelt, and he taught himself in that moment a habit he would keep for the rest of his life on that world. He rapped his knuckles 3 times, gently, on the deck plating before he touched her young. 3 soft knocks, "I'm here," "I'm coming, this is me." The cub's head came up at the sound. The matron's did not move at all, and he understood he had passed some test he hadn't known was being administered. "You're all right," he told the cub, which was a lie, and got his warm hands under its shoulders and got to work. He had not come to Threnody to save anything. He had come to Threnody to die, and everyone who signed the order had known it. That was the part the Tessellate Assembly never wrote down, but Tio had worked it out in his first month, sitting in the dark listening to the world try the seams of the station like a thief trying doors. The Assembly did not execute the personnel it found inconvenient, the specialists who asked the wrong question, the survey engineers who filed the report that embarrassed a syndic, the ones with no clan to raise a claim if they vanished. That would have looked like murder, and the Assembly cared above all things about how things looked. Instead, it posted them. It found a Category 1 world, a Deathworld, in the plain speech the Assembly disliked, that needed some piece of infrastructure tended, a relay, a beacon, a weather mast, and it assigned the inconvenient person to tend it alone, and it let the world do the work. The paperwork read service. The outcome read closed. Nobody had to look at anything. Tio Marsh had filed a report about a habitat shell contractor cutting the radiation shielding on a colony creche to make margin. The contractor had a cousin who sat on a procurement board. 6 weeks later, Tio had orders to Meridian Relay, Threnody, Soul Keeper, indefinite rotation, and a one-way berth on a supply hauler whose captain wouldn't meet his eyes. He was 29 years old. He was good with his hands and better with systems, and he had a stubborn streak his mother used to call his worst feature and his only one. When the hauler dropped him at Meridian and the pilot said, not unkindly, "Don't go outside at night," Tio had looked at the causeway and the black tree line beyond it and the 3 moons coming up ragged through the cloud, and he had thought, "They expect the world to do this, so I won't fight the world. I'll learn it." It was not courage. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, in the logs he kept for no one. It was spite, mostly, and the engineer's refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable just because the last 3 people had died of it. The last 3 keepers had treated Threnody as a siege. They had sealed the station, run the lights hot, fired the perimeter deterrents at every shadow, and burned through their power reserves and their nerve in a matter of weeks, until the world found the gap that fear always leaves. Tio read their logs and did the opposite of everything in them. He killed the floodlights and let his eyes learn the dark. He shut off the sonic deterrents, which he came to understand were not frightening the predators away but maddening them, a constant scream in a register the whole biosphere could feel. He stopped treating the acid rain as an attack and started treating it as weather, which is what it was: predictable, survivable, a thing you built gutters and catchments and drainage angles for instead of cowering from. He fixed the things the station needed to keep him alive, and then, because he was the kind of man who could not sit still in a working room, he started fixing the world's edges where they pressed against his. He rebuilt the causeway drainage so the night floods didn't strand animals on the high ground where they panicked and died. He capped the geothermal bleed vent that had been scalding anything that came to drink from the warm pool below it, and rerouted the heat so the pool stayed warm but the burn stopped. He learned that the small quill-backed scavengers he called spinehounds followed the warm pool, and that if he left the vent's grill clear of the ash that choked it, they cleared his perimeter of the biting swarm things that came up at dusk, and both of them came out ahead. None of it was kindness exactly. It was just an engineer who could not look at a broken system and leave it broken. But Threnody was a world where nothing had ever mended anything, where every relationship in the whole roaring ecosystem was predator and prey, and the space between them was measured in the length of a lunge. And into that world walked a soft, slow, clawless thing that fixed what it found and took nothing it didn't need. The world noticed. It took a long time, but the world noticed. The matron had noticed longest of all. The cub's leg was the easy part. Tio had set bones before his own once on a survey posting gone wrong, with a datapad reciting instructions and no anesthetic, which was the kind of experience that taught you your own hands could do more than you thought. The Vakar cub's hind limb had a clean transverse break, no splintering he could feel, and the joint above it was only dislocated. He warmed his hands again, wrapped his 3 knocks on the deck, braced the limb, and reset it in one steady pull while the cub screamed a sound that raised every hair on his body, and the matron came off her haunches with a roar that cracked the pressure seal on the inner hatch. Tio did not stop and did not flinch. That, he would think later, was probably the second test. "I know," he said to the cub, to the matron, to the storm, to all of it. "I know, it's done. Look, it's done." And it was. The cub, shaking, put weight on the reset joint, and the joint held, and the screaming dropped to a thin whine, and the matron's roar guttered out into that low grinding again, and she did not tear his arm off, which she could have done between one word and the next. The wound on the flank was the hard part, and the part that mattered. He cleaned it out under the worklight, and the smell told him what the color had already said. It had gone septic, the infection running up into the meat, and on Threnody, an infection like that was a death sentence with a slow fuse. He had a med kit built for a human metabolism. He had no idea if a single molecule of it would help a creature whose blood, when it welled up dark and thick, smelled of hot metal and something like crushed pepper. He had broad-spectrum antimicrobials meant for his own gut flora and no way to know if they'd poison the cub outright. He knelt there a long moment with the ampule in his warm hand and the matron's 4 iron eyes on him, and he made the call an engineer makes when the specification runs out. He tested, small, and he watched. He put a trace on the cub's tongue and waited an hour. No convulsion, no swelling. He put a proper dose into the meat around the wound and packed it clean and dressed it with the last of his sterile wrap, and he sat back against the locker and did not sleep, and neither did the matron, and neither did the storm, and somewhere in the black middle of that night, the cub's breathing found the bottom of a real breath and held it, and let it out slow and slept. By the time the storm broke and the ragged dawn came up gray over the tree line, the fever had turned. The cub woke and ate a strip of protein ration off Tio's flat palm with a delicacy that seemed impossible in a jaw built like a bear trap, and the matron watched it eat from his hand and made a sound Tio had never heard a Vakar make. A long, low, 3-part call that started in the throat bladder and rose and fell and rose, and rolled out through the open airlock and across the causeway and into the tree line, where, faint and far, something answered it. He didn't know, yet, what she had just told the world. He would find out. The whole galaxy would find out eventually. But that morning Tio Marsh only knew that a 2.5-meter apex predator was standing in his airlock watching her son eat out of his hand, and that when he got stiffly to his feet she did not tense, and when he reached out, slow, warm-handed, knuckles wrapping the plating first, and laid his palm flat against the side of that great armored head, she leaned into it, once, with a weight that could have crushed him, gentle as a held breath. "There," Tio said. His voice wasn't quite steady now. "There you go." Then she took her cub up in the needle jaw again, careful of the splinted leg, and she walked back out into the steaming morning, and he thought that was the end of it. A strange thing that had happened. A story he'd never get to tell anyone, filed in a log no one would read, on a world that was still, when all was said and done, going to kill him. He was wrong about the last part. He was wrong about all of it. 3 days later she was back, and she was not alone, and she was not carrying her own. The second young was not a Vakar at all. Tio heard the 3-note call at the tail of the afternoon. He'd have sworn later he could already tell her voice from the others, though he'd only heard it once. And he came out onto the causeway with his hands open, and there she stood at the far end where she always stopped, the matron, her healed cub a shadow at her flank already visibly stronger. But between them and the tree line was a second animal, and it was nothing like her. It was long and low and quilled, a spinehound but bigger than any he'd left the vent grill clear for. Its back a forest of black spines laid flat in a posture he'd learned meant fear held on a leash. In its mouth it carried a pup, a spinehound pup, Blind knew, its quills still soft as fern. The big spinehound would not come closer than 30 meters. It set the pup down on the causeway, and it looked at the matron, and the matron looked at Tio, and Tio understood that he was watching something happen that had no name in any language he knew. She had told the world. That three-part call over the tree line, she had told them. Not all of them. The world was too vast and too hungry for that. But the ones near enough to have watched him for a season. The ones who had also noticed the slow, clawless thing that mended what it found. The spinehound had a pup that was dying. He could see the wet rattle of it from here, and every instinct in its quilled body was screaming that the Vakar in front of it was death on 4 legs, and it had brought its dying pup to the edge of the killing ground anyway, because the matron had brought hers and walked away with it alive. "Oh," Tio said to no one, "oh, you've got to be joking." He wasn't joking. He walked out slow, warm-handed, 3 knocks on the causeway rail, past the matron close enough to feel the heat off her plating, and he knelt by the spinehound pup, while its mother trembled 30 meters off with every spine standing up now like a drawn bow. And he got his hands under it and felt the blocked gut, the twist of it, the thing that on any world was a quiet death, and on this one was being carried to a stranger by a creature that had every reason to run. It took him 2 hours and a length of catheter tubing, and everything he'd ever read about veterinary obstruction, most of it wrong for this animal, some of it close enough. When the blockage cleared and the pup mewled and rooted for something to nurse, the spinehound mother came across those 30 meters one shaking step at a time, and she did not attack him, and she took her pup back, and she stood a moment looking at him with eyes like drops of oil, and then she was gone into the trees. The matron watched the whole thing from 10 meters off with the stillness of a judge. When it was done, she made the 3-part call again, softer, and this time Tio thought he understood it, or at least understood what it did, because 2 nights later he woke to a scratching at the airlock and found a glider, one of the membrane-winged things that hunted the upper canopy, a creature he'd only ever seen as a silhouette against the moons, clinging to the outer hull with a hatchling folded under its wing that couldn't fly because one of the wing struts had grown crooked in the egg. And that was when Tio Marsh stopped pretending, even in the privacy of his own head, that this was a strange thing that had happened. It was a thing that was happening. It was going to keep happening. Somewhere out in the black tree line, in the language of a world that had never had a word for mercy until he stumbled onto it, the predators of Threnody had reached a decision about the soft creature in the relay station. They were bringing him their young. He straightened the glider hatchling's wing strut with a splint the size of a matchstick and a patience he didn't know he had, and he warmed his hands, and he rapped his 3 knocks, and he thought, "They posted me here to die." And he laughed once in the dark, a sound with no bitterness left in it at all, because for the first time since the orders came down he had understood the shape of the joke, and the joke was on the assembly, and it was only just beginning. By the turn of the season, Meridian Relay had become a thing no survey manual had a category for, and Tio had stopped trying to find one. The old maintenance bay, the big one that opened onto the causeway and had stood empty since the station was built for a crew of 12 that never came, he had turned into something between an infirmary and a den. He'd run heat lines under the deck plating so the floor held warm the way the geothermal pool did. He'd stripped the bunks out of the derelict crew quarters and torn the padding free and built low nests of it against the walls. He'd rigged the big roll door to open a hand's width at the bottom, an animal-height gap, so the thing was never sealed and never wide open, so anything on Threnody that needed him could come and go and nothing felt trapped, because trapped on this world meant dead and dead meant fighting. He did not decide to build a nursery. He built a solution to a problem that kept arriving, and one morning he stood in the doorway with a mug of recycled coffee going cold in his warm hands and counted what the problem had become. The Vakar cub healed, its splint long gone, its plating hardening toward stone, already half again the size it had been, asleep in the deepest nest with its reset leg tucked under it. The spinehound pup weaned now, chewing on a length of cable he'd given it for exactly that purpose. The glider hatchling in the rafters, wing strut straight, learning to glide in short terrified swoops from beam to beam. A pair of the burrowing armored things he'd started calling delvers, orphaned when a night flood took their den, curled together in the warm dark under the workbench. And more that came and went, mothers who left their sick young for a day and a night and came back for them, fathers he never saw who left the evidence of their passing in a fresh-killed storm elk laid across the causeway at dawn, tribute or payment or thanks. He never decided which. They were bringing him their young, and they were bringing him meat so he would not go hungry tending them. And the black tree line that had watched 3 keepers die watched T.O. Marsh with something that was no longer hunger. He kept the log. He wasn't sure why anymore. Habit, maybe, or the engineers need to write down what worked. He recorded the doses that helped and the ones that didn't, the way Vakar bone knit faster than human but glider bone slower, the fact that the spinehounds could not tolerate the antimicrobials that saved the Vakar, and needed instead a poultice of the same ash he'd once cleared off the vent grill. He built, without meaning to, the first veterinary text for a Category 1 biosphere that the Assembly had written off as a place things went to die. He did not think about the fact that such a text would be, to the right buyer, worth more than the relay, more than the station, more than his life. He should have thought about it, but he was busy, and he was happy, in the strange, bone-tired way of a man who has more work than hours and every hour of it matters, and he had forgotten to be afraid of anything but the world, which was the one thing on Threnody that had stopped trying to kill him. The Assembly had not stopped. The Assembly had simply forgotten he existed. That was the whole point of a posting like his. You were filed and closed and forgotten, and the machine moved on. Until the machine sent someone to confirm the file could be sealed for good. They came at the tail of the dry interval, a short-hull assembly cutter dropping through the cloud with its running lights stabbing the dusk, and T watched it come down on the old landing apron with a feeling in his gut he hadn't had in months. He knew what it was. He knew what it was for. A cutter like that carried an inspector and a closing order and a body recovery locker, and it came to Deathworld postings for exactly one reason, to make the paperwork match the assumption. He had about 4 minutes to decide what to do about the den. He decided to do nothing. That was the thing about T.O. Marsh that the contractor with the cousin on the procurement board had never understood, that the Assembly had never understood, that made him exactly the wrong man to quietly kill. He did not hide things that weren't wrong. He put the coffee down, and he walked out onto the causeway with his hands open and empty, and he let the inspector's crew see the relay station the way it actually was. Alan Pree had inspected 41 Deathworld postings in her career, and she had recovered 41 bodies, and she had stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. She was a xenobehaviorist by training, which was a cruel joke of an assignment, because there was no behavior to study on a closing inspection. Only the aftermath, the sealed room, the log that trailed off mid-entry, the small evidence of a person who had run out of world to survive. She had taken the work because it paid a clan debt, and because someone had to write the honest line in the file, the one nobody read, and she was the kind of person who could not make herself write a false one. She rode down in the cutter's jump seat with her recording gear cold in her lap and composed out of habit the first sentence of the report she was sure she would file. Keeper deceased, consistent with environmental predation. She had written it 41 times. Then the cutter's forward lights swept the causeway, and Alan Pree saw the human standing on it, alive, with his hands open, and she saw what was standing behind him, and every sentence she had ever composed went out of her head at once. Predator on the field, the pilot said, too high, his manipulators locking on the controls. Multiple predators, Inspector, those are apex signatures, that's a hole. He reached for the deterrent array. Don't, Alan said. Inspector, don't touch it, look at him. She was leaning forward against the restraint, all four of her eyes wide, her recording gear forgotten. Look at where he's standing. Look at where they're standing. Because that was the thing that made the back of her carapace crawl and her mind race all at once. The human was not cornered. The human was not fleeing. The apex predators, and there were four of them she could see, one of them a slate-gray monster half again the size of the cutter's landing strut, were not hunting him. They were arranged. Loosely, easily, the way she had seen an honor detail arrange itself around a person it was there to keep. Two of the big ones flanked him at the causeway's edge. One paced the tree line. And the largest, the gray one, stood at his shoulder like a thing carved there, and when the human raised one hand, palm out, toward the descending cutter, a gesture Alan understood without being told meant stop, easy mine. The gray monster's head turned and tracked the cutter with four eyes gone the color of a forge. Set us down, Alan said quietly. Away from him, and kill the deterrent array. Kill it now and do not turn it back on whatever happens. That thing will do exactly nothing, Alan said, unless we make him afraid. And I do not think, she added, watching the human tilt his head and say something to the monster at his shoulder, watching the monster lean, that mountain of killing weight, lean like a pet. I do not think anything on this world can make that man afraid anymore. They sat down at the far end of the apron. Alan went out alone, against every protocol, because protocol was written for the 41 and this was not the 41. And she crossed the apron on foot with her hands spread in the human gesture she had learned from 100 hours of survey footage. And she stopped at what she hoped was a respectful distance. And she looked at the man and the impossible court arranged around him. And she said, in the trade Creole the assembly used for its edges, Keeper. I am Alan Pre. I came to, and there she stopped, because I came to recover your body was the truth and was suddenly obscene. You came to close the file, Tio said, not unkindly. He had a tired, plain face, this human, ordinary as a doorframe, and he looked at her with an engineer's flat attention, taking her measure the way he'd take the measure of a part. It's all right. I know what the posting is. I've known since the second week. He glanced at the gray monster beside him, and the monster huffed a breath that stirred the ash on the causeway. The file's a little out of date is all. What? Alan's voice did a thing it had not done in years. It wobbled. Keeper Marsh. What am I looking at? And the human Tio. He told her to call him Tio, as if this were a thing you could be casual about. The human looked back at the four apex predators of a Category 1 Deathworld standing watch around a relay station that had killed everyone the assembly had ever sent to it, and he thought about how to answer. And what he finally said was the truest and least believable thing Alan Pre would hear in her life. They bring me their kids, he said. When the kids are sick, I fix what I can. Come and see, but warm your hands first and let me knock before you go in. They don't like cold hands and they don't like to be surprised. That's the whole trick. That's the only trick there is. She warmed her hands. She would remember, for the rest of her life, standing at a deck heater on a Deathworld beside a human, while a 2.5-meter apex predator watched her hold her manipulators over a glow bar like a child at a hearth, and understanding that she was being permitted, and that the permission had rules, and that the rules were not the humans. They were the world's, and the human had simply been the first person patient enough to learn them. Inside the den, Alan Pre forgot she was on assignment. The Vakar cub Tio called it Cinder, for the ember glow that came up in its throat bladder when it was content, came to investigate her. Its plating gone the hard gray of adulthood in waiting, and it put its blunt outer jaw against her carapace and breathed her in, and Tio said, easy, and it eased. The spinehound pup, no pup now but a lean quilled adolescent, watched her from a nest with the unblinking suspicion of the young. In the rafters the glider flying now, truly flying, its one crooked wing carrying it in tight clean circuits of the bay, folded itself into a corner of the ceiling and regarded her upside down. And under the workbench 2 armored delvers slept in a knot, and by the far wall a mother of some species Alan had no name for lay curled around a litter she had brought to heel, and did not so much as lift her head, because the human had knocked 3 times on the doorframe on the way in, and the sound had told the whole room this is allowed. "You built this," Alan said. She was crouched by Cinder, one manipulator flat against the cub's warm plating, and there were 41 bodies behind her in her career, and none of them, suddenly, weighed as much as this. "You built a place for them, on a world that has no such thing." "The world had all the parts," Tio said, mild, checking a dressing on the strange mother's litter with 2 fingers. "Warm floor, safe walls, food, someone who doesn't take. It just never had anyone to put the parts together. That's all engineering ever is. You find the pieces that want to fit and you stop the ones that don't from grinding." He glanced up at her. "You're writing this down." She was. Her recording gear was running for the first time on this assignment, and she was talking into it in a low, steady stream, and she could not stop, because Alan Pre was a xenobehaviorist, and she had just walked into the single most important behavioral event her field had ever recorded, and no part of her professional soul could let it pass unwitnessed. She got it all. She got the way the human warmed his hands each time before he touched a new patient, an unbroken ritual, and she filed it in her notes with a term she coined on the spot, and would defend before a full behavioral panel within the year. The warm-handed rule, the first cross-species courtesy protocol ever documented between humanity and a Category 1 apex fauna. She got the 3 knocks every time at every threshold, and named that too gravely into her recorder, the courtesy of 3, as if it were a treaty article, which she was coming to understand it was. Tio listened to her christen his tired habits with these solemn official names, and did not laugh, though the corner of his mouth moved. "They're just things that work," he said. "They are the terms of a peace," Alan said, "between your species and a biosphere that has never made peace with anything. Keeper Tio, do you understand what you have done here? Do you understand what this is worth?" And that was the moment the day turned, because Tio Marsh looked at her, and she watched the tired engineer's face go still and careful, and she realized she had said exactly the wrong true thing. "Worth," he repeated. "To the assembly, to research clans, to—" She stopped. She had been about to say to anyone who could reach this world and take what's in it, and she heard, a beat too late, what that sentence meant when the thing of value was a den full of the young of the deadliest predators in the catalog, and a man who could walk among them, and a log that told you exactly how. "Oh," Alan said softly. "Oh no." "Yeah," said Tio. "That's what I figured too." He straightened up and Cinder rose with him, unfolding to the man's shoulder height and leaning against his hip, and the human laid a hand on the great gray head without looking, the way you touch a doorframe in your own house. "The second you file a live report, I stop being a closed case. I become an asset, and the Assembly doesn't send inspectors to protect assets on Deathworlds. It sends contractors to strip them." He looked at her steadily. "Doesn't it?" Alan Pre, who had written the honest line in 41 files nobody read, discovered that she was about to do something that would end her career, and that she did not care. "Not," she said, "if the report gets lost." The report did not get lost, and it was not Alan Pre's fault. She tried. She deleted the cutter's sensor capture with her own manipulators and logged the posting closed as expected, keeper deceased, environmental predation. The 42nd time she had written the lie, and the first time she had written it to save a life instead of file a death. She would have gotten away with it, too, on any other posting, in any other season. But the cutter's pilot was a nervous young Sella named Wretch who had watched an apex predator the size of a landing strut lean against a human like a hound at a knee. And Wretch had done what nervous young clan climbers do when they see a thing that frightens them and might be worth something. He had opened a private channel while Alan was inside the den, and he had squirted a 30-second panic recording of the causeway, the human, the 4 apexes, the impossible arrangement, straight up the chain to the one person in the sector who paid quietly for exactly that kind of thing. Overseer Quinn Saravel received the recording at his desk aboard the sector administration platform, and he watched it 4 times, and on the 4th watching he began, very slowly, to smile. Quinn Saravel was Sella, tall and plated and formal, 4 eyes set in a long sculpted skull, and he had spent 30 years turning other people's inconveniences into his own margin. It was Quinn who had processed the orders that sent a troublesome human engineer to Threnody, a routine favor for a procurement colleague, worth a small ongoing consideration, entirely deniable. He had forgotten the man's name within the hour. He remembered it now. He watched the recording a 5th time, and he did not see, as Alan Pre had seen, a piece. Quinn Saravel had never in his life seen a piece. He did not have the equipment for it. What Quinn saw was inventory. A live and breeding population of Category 1 apex fauna, the most valuable biological commodity in the catalog, concentrated in one place and habituated. To approach on command. He saw the pelts and the plating and the venom glands and the breeding stock. He saw research clans in a bidding frenzy. He saw a private harvest off the books on a world already written off, tended by an asset the Assembly's own records listed as deceased. A dead man could not testify, could not file, could not exist. He saw, in short, the single cleanest opportunity of his long and grubby career, and he reached for his private ledger and began, in his careful sculpted hand, to make some calls. The man he called was named Harrower Vach, and Harrower Vach harvested worlds. Tio knew none of this that first evening, and if he had known it he would not have been surprised. He walked Alan back to her cutter in the last of the light, Cinder pacing them at a polite distance, and he said the thing he'd been turning over since she said the word worth. "You should file it," he told her. "The live report, honest, all of it." Alan stopped dead on the apron. "I have just spent an hour," she said, "learning how to hide it to keep you alive." "I know, and I'm grateful, and it won't work." He said it without drama, the way he said everything, a man reading a gauge. "You saw the pilot's face. Somebody already knows. Somebody always already knows that's how the Assembly runs, its leaks all the way down. If the honest report doesn't exist, then the only version that exists is whatever the leak sells, and the leak's version won't have you in it, and it won't have the truth in it, and it won't have the one thing that might actually matter." He looked at her. "It won't have a witness who's willing to say out loud that this is real, that it's mine. That taking it would be theft, not salvage. They will not care that it is theft. No, but the ones who might stop them will only be able to stop them if there's a record that says so." He shrugged, a small tired motion. "I've been the guy with no record before. That's how I ended up here. I'm not doing it again. Whatever's coming, I want it in the light." So Alan Pre undid her own deletion, and she filed the honest report, Keeper Marsh alive, posting Threnody home to a documented cross-species care event without precedent in Assembly records. The fauna a protected population under her professional recommendation. Any harvest a crime and an atrocity, and she filed it not up the quiet chain where Quinn Saravel could bury it, but wide, to the behavioral panel, to the xenobiology registry, to 3 research clans she trusted, and 1 journal that could not be leaned on. She copied it to places that would keep it. And then she flew off Threnody not knowing if she had saved the man or painted a target on him, and hating that she could not tell which. Behind her, on the darkening causeway, Tio Marsh stood with his hand on a warm gray head and watched her running lights climb into the cloud. And he thought about the shape of what was coming the way he thought about weather, not with fear, but with the flat practical attention of a man deciding where to build the gutters. Because he had seen the pilot's face too, and he was an engineer. He knew that a system under load fails at its weakest point, and he knew that his weakest point was not the station and was not the world. It was the young. Whatever came for Threnody would come, in the end, for the den. And Tio Marsh, who had never in his life started a fight, began that night to prepare for the only one he intended to finish. The gray matron had no word for what the soft thing was to her, because her kind had never needed one. Her world was old and simple, and it ran on a single law, and the law was that the strong ate and the weak were eaten, and the space between was the length of a lunge. She had lived her whole long life inside that law. She had killed more than she could count. She had lost young to the floods and the storms and the other apexes, and to her own inability, again and again, to do the one thing the law forbade, which was to make a broken thing whole. That was the grief that had no lunge to answer it, the sick cub, the twisted limb, the wound gone bad, the enemy the law gave her no weapon against. She had carried 3 young to their deaths across the seasons and buried none of them, because her kind did not bury, they only walked away. Then the flat cold structure at the edge of her range had changed. The screaming had stopped, the constant maddening scream that had lived in the ground for as long as the structure stood, that had driven her kind half-mad along the whole northern shelf. The scalding water at the drinking pool had gone gentle. The floods had learned to run in channels. And a thing had come out of the structure that did not hunt. She had watched it for a season, and it had never once hunted. A slow, soft, clawless thing that took the ash off the vents and mended the ground, and when the small quilled ones came near it, did not kill them. So when her last cub took the flank wound and the fever came, and the law offered her nothing but the long walk away, the matron had done the thing no Vakar had ever done. She had gone to the thing that mended instead of the thing that killed. She had put her dying young down in front of the soft creature, and she had waited to be shown, one more time, that the law was the only law. And the soft thing had warmed its clawless paws, and knocked its small courtesy on the ground, and made her cub whole. There is no word in any tongue for what that did to her. The nearest word is not loyalty, and it is not love. It is the thing underneath both of those, the thing they are built from, the recognition, bone deep and past all argument, of a greater strength than her own. Not strength of the lunge. She was still the master of that and knew it. A strength the law had never contained, the strength to unmake death. She had met at the end of her long life an apex above the apex, and it wore a soft clawless shape and warmed its hands before it touched her young. And from the moment her cub breathed clean again, the matron of the northern shelf belonged to it the way the tide belongs to the moons. She told the world. That was the 3-part call down the shelf, across the floodplain, into the ranges where the other mothers grieved the wounds the law could not answer. She told them what she had found. And one by one, the ones near enough to have watched, the ones with a sick cub and nothing but the long walk to offer it, came to the edge of the killing ground and set their young down in front of the soft apex and waited to be shown. That was why they brought him their young, not because he had tamed them. Nothing on Threnody could be tamed, and he had never tried. They brought him their young because he could do the one thing their whole roaring world could not, and because a creature that can unmake death is not a creature you tame. It is a creature you follow. Tio prepared the way he did everything, with his hands and without illusions. He did not fortify the station. That was the first mistake in every dead keeper's log, treating the relay as a fortress, when a fortress was only a box that told the world exactly where you were and how frightened. He did the opposite. He made the den soft and open and easy to leave, and he made the ground around it hard to cross for anything that came with cages and weapons and the intent to take. He knew the terrain now the way he knew the station's wiring. He knew where the night floods ran and how deep, because he'd built the channels. He knew which stretches of the causeway approach turned to sucking ashmire in the wet, because he'd mapped everyone draining them. He knew the throat of the pass above the landing apron, the only ground a heavy lander could set down on, and he spent 3 days quietly recutting the drainage above it so that the next hard rain, and on Threnody there was always a next hard rain, would turn that apron into a shallow lake and the pass below it into a river. He did not build a single weapon. He built weather. He built the world's own reflexes into a shape that would answer him. and he moved the young. Not far, he found the old geothermal service tunnel that ran under the station from the days when Meridian was meant to house 12, a warm, dry throat of rock and conduit that opened, at its far end, into the flank of the ridge behind the tree line, a back door into the world that no lander could reach and no map in the Assembly's files had ever recorded, because the crew that would have mapped it never came. He cleared it. He warmed it. He walked Cinder through it a dozen times, and the Spinehound and the Delvers and the strange quiet mother with her healing litter, and he taught them, with 3 knocks and a warmed hand and a low word, that when the sound came, the particular whooping alarm he rigged to the perimeter sensors, a sound he chose because nothing else on Threnody made it. They went to the tunnel, and they went to the ridge, and they waited in the world where they were the law and no cage had ever been. He did not tell himself it would be enough. He was an engineer. He did not lie to himself about load. He told himself only that it was the strongest point he could build, and that the rest would depend on the one variable he could not calculate and would not have traded for any fortress in the catalog. The matron had stopped leaving. She had a range the size of a small country, and she had kept to it her whole life, coming to the causeway and going, apex and free. Now she stayed. She lay across the causeway's mouth at night with her chin on her forelegs and her 4 eyes half-lidded and open, and Cinder lay against her side, already nearly her size, the emberglow rising and falling in both their throats. And when Tio came out in the dark to check the sensors, she would rumble once low, a sound he had come to read as clearly as speech, "I have him," and he would put his warm hand on her head and say, "I know, me too," and go back inside to work. He was not alone anymore. He had not been alone, he realized one night in a long time. The Assembly had sent him to the loneliest death it could arrange. One man on a world at the edge of everything, and the world had answered by giving him the largest family on Threnody. He thought the Assembly would find that funny, if the Assembly could laugh. Then he thought about what was coming down through the cloud to take that family apart and sell it by the pound. And he stopped thinking about laughing, and he went back to cutting drainage. Harrower Vok had hunted the beasts of 40 worlds, and he had never lost, and he had a wall of skulls to prove it. He was Katai, a tall, heavy, forward-leaning people, all cabled muscle under a hide of interlocking scoots, with a jaw that could shear bone, and a pair of forward-facing eyes that had made his ancestors the apex of their own homeworld long before they left it. The Katai told themselves they were the finest predators the galaxy had produced, and Harrower Vok told it louder than most, because he had built a company on it. The Rendhook Company took the jobs no sane crew would take, the Deathworld harvests, the apex culls, the live capture contracts that other outfits filed under unsurvivable, and it came back every time with a full hold and a lighter roster. And Vok counted the dead crew the way he counted the dead beasts, as the cost of being the thing that wins. When Quen Saravel's offer came through, a Category 1 world, a habituated apex population, a private harvest off the Assembly's books, no protected status that couldn't be made to disappear, and a dead-on paper caretaker who could not testify to anything, Harrower Vok did not hesitate, and he did not haggle much, which for a Katai was practically a courtesy. He had heard the rumor already, the thing riding the low channels, a soft, clawless human on a Deathworld, walking among apex predators that lay down for it. Most of the Rendhook laughed at it. Vok had not laughed. Vok had felt something he had not felt in a long time, a thing he did not have a clean word for and did not examine, which was the particular hunger a predator feels when it hears there might be a bigger one. "It's a trick," his second, a lean, scarred Katai named Sesk, said, watching the 30-second recording for the 10th time in the Rendhook's dim hold. "Sedation, pheromone lure. Nobody walks among apex fauna. The humans rigged it somehow. We take the rig, we take the beasts, we take the human's head for the bounty, we go home rich." "Maybe," said Vok. He was watching the part of the recording the others skipped, the moment the human raised his hand and the gray monster turned its head, and the monster's eyes for one frame before the recording cut. Vok had looked into a great many apex eyes over the length of his wall of skulls. At the end, in the moment they understood, he knew the look of a beast that has met the thing that beats it. He had put that look on the faces of 40 worlds worth of monsters. He had never once seen it looking out of a monster at something else. "Full kit," he said. "Cages, culls, the heavy netting, the sonic lances, the works, and the atmosphere gear. I want us able to work through a storm. I'm not waiting on that world's weather." He rewound the recording again to the gray eyes, the one frame. "And I want the human alive when we land. I'll take the head myself." After what? Harrower Vok did not answer, because the answer was after I've seen it up close, after I've stood where he stands and had the big one turn for me, after I know whether the rumor's a trick or whether there's finally, on some forgotten edge of the catalog, a predator worth the name. And none of that was a thing a cock I said out loud, least of all the harrower of the Rendhook, whose whole legend rested on there being nothing above him. So he only bared his shearing jaw in the expression his crew had learned to fear, and he said, "Plot the burn. We harvest in the wet season. I want the ground soft when they run." He thought the soft ground would help him. That was the first thing Harrower Vok got wrong about Threnody, and it was very far from the last. Alan Pre found out about the harvest the way honest people usually find out about the machine's quieter business, too late, and by accident, and at the cost of everything she had. Her honest report had detonated in the places she'd sent it. The behavioral panel had convened. The xenobiology registry had flagged Threnodi's fauna for emergency protected status. 2 of the 3 research clans had begun the paperwork to fund a proper expedition, a real one, with witnesses and law and light, exactly what Tio had asked for. For a few days, Alan had let herself believe the light would be enough. Then the sanctions came, not for the harvest for her. A formal reprimand for undertaking unauthorized contact with hazardous fauna, a second for filing outside the chain, a third, the killing one, for falsification, because someone had produced her original deletion, the one she'd undone, and framed it as evidence that her honest report was the lie. She recognized the hand in it the way you recognize a smell. Quen Saraval had reached into her file and turned her own integrity into the weapon against her, and he had done it fast and clean, and she understood, reading the sanctions, that he was not doing it to punish her. He was doing it to discredit the report, to muddy the one record that said the harvest would be a crime, so that, when it happened, the only clear document in the system would be a keeper long dead, and a fauna population no honest inspector had ever confirmed. He was clearing the light, so the taking could happen in the dark. Alan Pre sat with the sanctions for 1 hour. Then she did the sum, the way Tio did his sums, flatly, without illusion. Her career was over regardless. The machine had already decided that. What was still live, still uncalculated, was the man on Threnody and the den full of the young and the 4 days, maybe 5, before the wet season opened the world and a harvest crew she now knew by name, the Rendhook Company, Harrower Vok commanding, a name that turned up in 40 worlds worth of atrocity filed under salvage, dropped through the cloud with cages. She could not stop it. She had no authority left to stop anything. But she had a fast courier's berth she had not yet been formally stripped of, and she had a voice, and she had a witness's testimony that was worth exactly nothing in the system and might be worth everything to the one man who had asked her, on a dark causeway, to keep the truth in the light no matter what. She burned her last clean credit chartering the courier. She left ahead of the order that would have grounded her, and she flew for Threnody a day and a half in front of the Rendhook, not to save anyone. She had no way to save anyone, but to stand on that causeway again and tell Tio Marsh what was coming, so that whatever he built to meet it, he would build knowing the true shape of the thing. It was, she thought, flying into the dark with her career burning behind her, the least a witness could do. And it was, though she did not know it yet, exactly enough. She came down through the cloud 2 days later, and Tio was on the apron before her cutter's struts touched, because the matron had known something was in the sky a full minute before the sensors did, and had come up off the causeway with her crest high, and he had learned to trust that crest over any instrument he owned. "Easy," he told her, hand flat on the gray plating. "Friend, that one's a friend." And the matron read the word in his voice if not the sound of it, and her crest came down, and she let Alan cross the apron alive for the second time. Alan looked worse than she had. Something in the way she held herself had gone brittle. She did not waste the greeting. "For days," she said, "perhaps 3 now. A harvest crew, the Rendhook Company, the worst in the sector. They have done this on 40 worlds. Cages, sonic lances, heavy netting, atmosphere gear so the storms won't stop them. Their commander wants the fauna alive for breeding stock and dead for everything else, and he wants you." She stopped. "He has a contract for your head, because a dead keeper cannot testify. I could not stop it. I burned everything I had and I could not stop it. I could only come and tell you so that I'd know the true shape of it," Tio finished. He didn't sound surprised. He didn't sound afraid. He looked at her with that flat engineer's attention, and then he did a thing that undid her a little. He reached out and put a warm hand on her shoulder, the same gesture he used on the matron. "This is me, this is allowed," and he said, "You kept the truth in the light. That's the whole job. That's the only job. The rest is mine and theirs and the world's." He looked past her at the tree line, at the clouds stacking black and heavy along the northern shelf, the wet season coming in like a tide. "Atmosphere gear," he repeated, and for the first time something moved in his tired face that was almost, not quite, a smile. "They think they're bringing their weather with them. Tio, there are 20 of them. They are Katai, they are built for killing, and they will come armed for exactly this. You have," she gestured, helpless at the station, "the causeway, the den, the great gray beast. You have no weapons." "No," Tio agreed. "I don't." He turned and looked back at the den, at the low, warm mouth of it where Cinder stood watching them, grown now nearly to the matron's size, his young plating on the hard gray of stone, the ember glow steady in his throat, at the spinehound pacing the roof line, at the tree line beyond, where the dark was full of eyes he could feel and not see, the mothers and the fathers and the whole watching shelf that had learned, this season, the one thing their world had never known, that there was a place, and a soft apex who kept it, where the young were safe. "I don't have any weapons, Alan," Tio said, and now it was a smile, small and grim and certain. "I have their kids, and in about 2 days, a man who harvests worlds is going to land on the one world in the catalog where every apex predator for 100 kilometers has a personal reason to care what happens to the guy in the middle." He picked up his tools. "Warm your hands," he said. "You're staying and you're recording every second of it and you're keeping it in the light because when this is over, the version that survives is going to be the true one. Come on. There's work. Let me show you where the young go when the whooping starts, so you can go with them. And so you'll know why nothing that comes down that pass is going to reach them." The 2 days were not quiet, and Tio had not expected them to be. The Rendhook sent a scout ahead, a small skimmer drone, matte and silent, dropping through the cloud on the first afternoon to map the ground and count the beasts. Tio saw it on the sensors before he saw it in the sky, and he stood on the causeway and watched it come, and he did nothing because the drone was not the thing he needed to answer, and because he wanted Vok to see exactly what Vok expected to see. A lone soft human, unarmed on an open causeway with no fortress and no gun. What the drone did not understand, and what harrower Vok would therefore not understand, was the tree line. The skimmer came in low over the northern approach to run its count, and the count it took was wrong in a way no instrument could correct, because the beasts of Threnody did not read as a population that afternoon. They read as an ambush holding its breath. The drone logged 4 apex signatures near the station and moved on, satisfied, and it never logged the other 40. The mothers laid flat in the flood channels with their young moved back into the ridge. the fathers in the high rock with the wet coming, the spinehound packs strung along the tree line in a silence they did not normally keep. It never logged them because they did not want to be logged, and on Threnody a predator that does not want to be seen is not seen until the lunge. The drone flew home with a tidy underestimate, and Harrower Vok read it and smiled, and told his crew it would be an easy season. Tio watched the skimmer climb away and felt the cold certainty settle in him a little deeper. They were coming in blind. They thought they knew the ground and they knew nothing, and the not knowing was the strongest wall he had. He spent the first night in the tunnel with the young. He did it because the whooping alarm was only as good as their trust in it, and trust was built in the dark, in repetition, in warmth. So he ran the drill one more time, the alarm, the walk, the ridge, and then he stayed, and he sat in the warm rock throat of the tunnel with Cinder's head heavy across his knees, and the spinehound's chin on his boot, and the delver's burrowed against his side, and the strange, quiet mother's litter piled in his lap, and he did the thing he had done every night since the matron first walked into his airlock. He warmed his hands. He knocked his 3 soft knocks on the stone. And he told them, in the low, even voice they knew better than any word, that he had them, that this was allowed, that the thing coming down out of the sky would not reach this warm, dark place, because he had built it not to, and because everything with teeth on the northern shelf had decided the same. Alan recorded it. She could not help herself. She sat at the mouth of the tunnel with her gear running, and she captured a human asleep against a 2.5-meter apex predator, both of them breathing slow, the ember glow rising and falling in the beast's throat like a banked fire, and she narrated it into the record in a voice that shook, because she was a scientist, and she knew she was looking at the single most valuable behavioral document of her age, and she knew, too, that its whole value was that it was true, and that in 2 days men were coming to make it not true, and she was going to keep it in the light if it was the last honest thing she ever did. On the second day the wet season broke, and the world showed its other face. It came the way Tio had known it would, because he had spent a year learning its weather the way you learn a friend's moods, first the pressure dropping until his ears ached, then the light going the color of a bruise, then the wind laying the tree line flat, and then the rain, not the acid drizzle of the dry interval but the true wet season deluge, a rain that fell in ropes and turned the whole northern shelf to running silver in under an hour. The drainage channels he had cut for a year filled and ran and did their patient work. The apron began, exactly as he had engineered it to begin, to hold water. The throat of the pass below it, the only ground a heavy lander could set down on, deepened toward the river he had shaped it to become. He stood in the open den mouth and let the rain sheet off him and watched his weather come true, and he thought about the man flying toward it with atmosphere gear and 40 worlds of certainty, and he felt no triumph, only the flat readiness of a system coming under the load it was built for. "They will land in this?" Alan asked. She had to raise her voice over the rain. She was frightened, and doing the thing frightened brave people do, which was to keep working anyway. "They'll land in this," Tio said. "That's the whole point of the atmosphere gear. Vok reads the storm as an obstacle he's beaten. He thinks working through the weather is his advantage, that we'll be blind and pinned in it, and he won't. He wiped the rain out of his eyes. He's right that we'll be in it. He's wrong about whose weather it is." The matron came up beside him in the downpour, unbothered by the rain that steamed off her plating, and behind her, out of the streaming dark of the tree line, Tio felt more than saw the shelf gather. He could not have counted them and did not try. He knew only that the drone's tidy number was a lie, and that somewhere in the running silver dark every mother whose young he had mended, every father who had laid a kill across his causeway, every quilled pack that had cleared his perimeter of the biting swarms, had come down off the ranges in the storm and taken up a place he had not assigned and could not command, arranged by a law older than any he understood, waiting. Cinder came to stand at his other side. The cub was a cub no longer. He topped the matron now by a head, his stone-gray plating scarred already from the season's hunts, his double jaw wider than Teo's whole body, the ember glow in his throat gone from the soft flicker of the sick young thing on the airlock floor to a steady forge light that lit the rain around them amber. Teo remembered the shallow, wrong breathing, the fever, the reset joint, the strip of ration off his flat palm. He put his warm hand on the massive, scarred head, and Cinder leaned into it the way he had leaned when he was the size of a dog, gentle as a held breath, and something went tight and certain in Teo's chest. "Big man now," he said quietly under the rain just to him. "Look at you. You weren't going to make it that first night, and look at you now." Cinder's throat glow pulsed. In the dark below the pass, a lander's engines were coming down through the cloud, red and blind and confident, into a world that had spent a year learning to answer one soft, clawless hand. "Easy," Teo told the whole streaming dark, told the shelf, told the forge-lit beast at his side and the gray matron at his other and the 40 in the tree line he could not see. "Easy. Not yet. Let them land. Let them get out of the ship where the world can reach them. Then we'll see whose weather this is." The Rentuk's lander came down on the flooded apron in a scream of engines and a boil of steam, and Harrower Vok walked down the ramp into the rain like a man stepping onto ground he already owned. He was bigger than Alan's warning had let Teo picture, a head and a half taller than Teo, forward-leaning, his scoot hide beaded silver with rain, his shearing jaw set in the fixed half-open display, "The kata used to mean I am the thing that wins." Behind him, his crew came down the ramp in ordered ranks, 20 of them, cabled and armored, sonic lances slung and cage drones folded on their backs, and the heavy netting coiled on drums. And they fanned out across the apron with the brisk contempt of professionals who have done this on 40 worlds and expect nothing new from the 41st. Teo stood at the head of the causeway with the rain sheeting off him, alone, hands open and empty, exactly as the drone had promised. He had sent Alan back with a wide-angle lens and a clear line and one instruction: record everything, no matter what, and do not come out. He had sent the young to the ridge. He stood in the open with nothing on him harder than a wrench, and he watched Harrower Vok cross the flooded apron toward him, and he did not move. "You'll be the keeper," Vok said. His trade Creole was rough chewed. He stopped a few paces off and looked Teo up and down, the plain, tired face, the worn coveralls, the empty hands, and something in the set of his jaw shifted toward contempt, because Harrower Vok had expected, against his own better sense, to feel the thing he'd felt watching the recording, and the soft creature in front of him did not look like the top of any food chain. "Huh. Smaller than the story, they always are." He tilted his heavy head. "You know why I'm here." "I know exactly why you're here," Teo said. "A man named Quen Saravel is paying you to strip this world and take my head so I can't tell anyone he did it." He said it flatly, conversationally, the way he'd tell you a bearing was worn. "You've done it on 40 worlds. You've never lost. You've got 20 guns and cages and gear built to work through the storm. And you think the storm is the worst thing this world is going to throw at you." He wiped the rain from his eyes. "I'm telling you once, because after this I won't get the chance, and because I don't want it on me that I didn't. Get back on your ship. Take Saravel's money and tell him the world already killed me. Nobody has to open a single cage. Everybody flies home." Behind Vok, a couple of the Katai made the coughing rasp that was their laughter. Vok did not laugh. Vok was watching the human's face, waiting for the fear, the bluff, the tell, and finding none of it, finding instead the flat certainty of a man reading him a weather report, and it put a thread of something cold up the back of his scoots that he did not like and refused to name. "That's a lot of warning," Vok said slowly, "from a man with no gun." "I don't have a gun," Teo agreed. "Then what," said Harrower Vok, "exactly is going to stop me?" And Teo Marsh looked at him. This tall, arrogant killer standing on a flooded apron on a world he had already decided he understood. And for the first time since the ramp came down, something moved in the human's tired face that was almost pity. "You are," Teo said, The second you make this world afraid, it's going to show you what it does to things that make it afraid. I've spent a year learning to keep it calm. You just landed 20 guns in the middle of it and told it you came for its children." He stepped back 1 pace, off the head of the causeway, giving the ground between them to the rain. "I'm going inside now. Do whatever you came to do. But the young aren't here, and they aren't anywhere you can reach, and every mother on this shelf watched you land." He turned his back on the apex predator of 40 worlds, which no one had done in a very long time, and lived, and he walked toward the station through the streaming dark. "Warm your hands," he said over his shoulder, almost gently. "Not that it'll help you now." HFY let him walk. That was pride, and it was the second thing the world would make him pay for. A lesser commander would have shot the human in the back on the apron, and been done with the strange cold feeling in his scoots. But HFY had a wall of skulls and a legend to feed, and the legend did not eat men shot in the back. It ate the moment at the end, when the thing that thought it was the apex understood that it was not. He wanted that moment from the human. He wanted to stand where the human stood and have the gray monster turn for him. So he let Tio Marsh walk into the station, and he split his crew the way he had split it on 40 worlds. Half to secure the structure and the caretaker, half to push into the tree line and start the count and the cull, and he told himself the cold feeling was the storm. The half that pushed into the tree line did not come back. It did not happen all at once, and that was the horror of it for the Katai who lived to remember it. It happened the way weather happens. The cull team went into the streaming dark of the tree line in ordered ranks with their sonic lances up, and the lances found nothing, because the sonic lance was built to panic a beast into breaking cover, and the beasts of Threnody did not panic and did not break. They had been screamed at by the station's deterrents for years and had learned to hold, and now the same men who thought sound was a weapon walked into a wall of predators that had already survived worse sound than they could make. The tree line closed around the cull team without a sound of its own. There was a burst of lance fire, wild, in 3 directions. There was one scream, cut short. Then there was only the rain, and the ordered ranks did not come out of the tree line. And after a while the tree line was quiet in a way that was worse than any noise. Vox second came to him on the apron with his lance still up and his forward eyes gone wide. "We've lost contact with the cull team, all of them. 10 signatures gone, no distress, nothing, they just stopped." His voice climbed. "Harrower, there's nothing on the sensors. The drone said 4 apex signatures. There is nothing on the sensors and we have lost 10. "The drone was wrong," said Vox. He was looking at the tree line. The cold thread up his scoots had become a cable. The count was wrong. They didn't want to be counted. He was, whatever else he was, a predator of 40 worlds, and a predator knows the exact moment the ground shifts under it from hunter to hunted, and Harrower Vox knew it now, standing on a flooding apron with half his crew swallowed by a silence, and he made the only decision his pride would let him make, which was the wrong one. "Pull everyone to the station," he said. "We take the caretaker, alive. We put him on the causeway where the gray one can see him, and we put a lance to his head, and we let the whole shelf watch." His jaw set. "They lay down for him, they protect him. Fine. Then he's the leash. Nothing moves on us while we hold him. We load what we can reach. We take him and his den off this rock, and we harvest the rest from orbit with the world too busy keeping him alive to fight." He turned for the station. "Every world has a lever. He's this one's. Move." It was a good plan. It had worked in one shape or another on a dozen worlds. It failed on Threnody for a reason Harrower Vox was constitutionally unable to understand until it was far too late, and the reason was this. The lever theory assumes the thing you threaten is loved, and love can be coerced. But the shelf did not love Tio Marsh. Love was not the law. What the shelf felt for the soft apex who unmade death was past love, underneath it, older, and you cannot put a lance to the head of a thing that 100 predators recognize as the strength above their own and expect the recognition to bargain. Recognition does not bargain. Recognition answers. Vok was about to teach every apex on the northern shelf that the soft one could bleed. He had no idea what he was about to unleash. They took Tio out of the station without much trouble because he did not fight them, because fighting them was not the plan and never had been. He let them put the restraints on his wrists. He let them march him back out through the rain to the head of the causeway, 4 kati around him and Vok behind, and he stood where they put him, at the exact spot where the matron had first walked into his life, and he looked out into the streaming dark of the tree line, and he was, to Alan Pre's lens recording it all from the station's high window, terribly and completely calm. He did not look like a lever. He looked like a man who had built something and was watching it come under load, checking it, one last time, against the specification. "Gray 1, Vok bellowed into the rain. He had a sonic lance in one hand and the other clamped on the back of Tio's neck, and he shoved the human forward to the causeway's edge where the whole shelf could see. "You want him. Here he is. Anything comes out of that tree line, anything moves on my crew, and I open his skull. You understand me? I've hunted your betters on 40 worlds. You lie down or he dies." He was breathing hard. Around the flooded apron his remaining crew had formed a tight ring, lances out, cages ready, and for a moment the terrible plan seemed to hold because nothing came out of the tree line. The dark stayed dark. The rain came down. And the matron came up out of the flood channel not 10 meters away, where she had been lying flat and gray as a drowned log the entire time, close enough to have taken Vok's head off before he ever reached the causeway, and had not, because the soft one had told the whole shelf, "Easy, not yet. Let them land." Vok flinched hard and swung the lance toward her. She did not charge. She rose out of the running water to her full height, water sheeting off the great gray plating, the ember glow coming up in her throat, and she stood there in the rain and looked at harrower Vok with 4 eyes gone the color of a forge. And Vok, the apex of 40 worlds, felt the thing he had crossed the galaxy to feel, and understood in the same instant that he had gotten it exactly backwards. He had come to have the monster turn for him. The monster was turning for him now, and it was not recognition in those forge-colored eyes. It was a verdict. "Back," he screamed, and jammed the lance not at the matron but against Tio's temple, because the plan, the lever, back or I. "Don't," Tio said. He did not say it to Vok. He said it to the matron, to Cinder somewhere in the dark, to the 40 in the tree line, to the whole gathered shelf. The same word he'd said 100 nights, in the same low, even voice, the voice they knew better than any sound in their world. Easy. Not yet. And impossibly in the roar of the rain, with a lance against his keeper's skull, the shelf held. The matron stood trembling with the want of it, the ember glow blazing in her throat, and she held, because he had asked her to, and harrower Vok saw the monster obey the soft thing's word and made the last mistake of his life. He read the obedience as leverage. He thought he had found the seam. He struck Tio across the face, with the lance to prove to the shelf that he could. It was not a killing blow. It split the skin over Tio's cheekbone and snapped his head sideways and put him down on one knee on the wet grating, and it drew, into the rain, running pink, and then red down the side of the soft, clawless apex's ordinary face. The one thing harrower Vok should have understood: he must never, on any world, in any weather, allow the watching shelf to see. Blood. The soft one, who unmade death, who warmed his hands and knocked his 3 small knocks and took nothing and mended everything, the strength above their strength, bleeding on his knees, struck down by the thing that came for the young. The rain seemed to stop, though it did not stop. The whole northern shelf drew one breath. And Tio Marsh, on one knee with the blood running down his face and the lance at his head, looked up through the rain at the gray matron shaking with the leash of his own word, and he was done building gutters, and he was done keeping the peace, and he spent the calm he had spent a year earning, all of it, in a single quiet sentence. "All right," he said, "now." The word had barely left him when the world came off the leash, and Alan Pre, recording from the high window with her manipulators shaking on the gear, understood at last, all at once, what a year of quiet had been holding back. It did not come as a charge. Threnody did not charge. Threnody closed. The tree line simply ceased to be empty. Where there had been running dark, there were 40 apex predators moving low and fast and silent through the silver rain, and the ring of Katai on the flooded apron had time for exactly one volley of lance fire, wild, screaming into the dark at targets that were already past them, before the ring stopped being a ring. Alan would not afterward describe most of what she recorded, though she kept every frame of it in the light as she had promised. It was not the massacre the word suggests. It was faster than a massacre and quieter, and somehow more total. The practiced, economical violence of a world that had been perfecting exactly this since, before the Katai's homeworld had cooled, applied all at once to 20 invaders who had built their whole legend on being the fastest and most total thing in any room they entered, and who discovered in the space of 30 seconds that they had walked into the one room in the catalog where they were neither. The heavy netting drums came apart. The cage drones never deployed. The sonic lances, the crew's whole answer to the fauna of 40 worlds, wailed their panic note into the storm and the beasts of Threnody, who had been screamed at by that station's deterrents for years and had learned in their bones that sound was a thing you endured, came through it without slowing, and the lances went silent one after another, and the apron that Vok had chosen for its firm footing had become, exactly on the schedule Tio had cut into it a year before, a shallow running lake. So that the Katai who tried to fall back to the lander found the ground gone to sucking ashmire under their feet, and the pass below it gone to a river, and the lander itself standing hub-deep in rising water with its ramp awash, and no dry ground anywhere to make a stand on. Because the soft, clawless keeper had spent a year teaching the world's own where to put its weight. The world took them apart on ground of the keeper's choosing, in weather of the keeper's shaping, and it did it for the keeper's sake, and there was nothing in it Harrower Vok's legend had prepared him to survive. Harrower Vok did not run, and it would be the one thing said in his favor at the end, though there was no one of his crew left to say it. He had a lance in his hand and a bleeding human at his feet and 40 apex predators dismantling everything he had brought to this world. And the Katai in him, the real thing under the legend, understood that this was the moment his whole life had been walking toward. So he did what predators do. He looked for the one above him, and he faced it. He found the matron already coming. She came for him alone. The rest of the shelf had the crew. The matron had Vok, and she crossed the flooded causeway to him through the rain at a walk, unhurried, because there was no longer any hurry, and Harrower Vok raised his lance and put everything he was into the thing he had crossed the galaxy to do. He faced the apex of a Deathworld eye to eye, one predator to another, and for one heartbeat he felt the old certainty, the wall of skulls, the 40 worlds, I am the thing that wins. Then the matron did not fight him like a beast. She stopped, a stride away, and she looked at Harrower Vok with those forge-colored eyes, and she did the thing that broke him. She looked past him. She dismissed him. She turned her great gray head in the middle of the reckoning, away from the apex of 40 worlds as though he were not worth the whole of her attention, and she looked at the human bleeding on his knees behind him, and she made the low sound, the one Tio knew, the one that meant I have him. And Harrower Vok understood, in the last clear moment he was given, the thing he had come across the galaxy to feel and had gotten exactly, fatally backwards. He had wanted to be recognized as the apex. He was being recognized. He was being recognized as nothing, as an interruption, a weather event, a thing between the matron and the one that mattered, to be removed and forgotten. There was no wall of skulls in her eyes. There was no acknowledgement of a worthy rival. There was only a mother looking over the top of him at her keeper, and the total, obliterating indifference of a creature that had already met the strongest thing in its world and knew, past all argument, that it was not him. The legend of the Rendhook Company ended on that flooded causeway, not with a roar but with a dismissal. And if there is a worse death for a thing that has built its whole self on being feared, No one on Threnody could imagine it. The world was merciful in its way. It was quick. When it was over, the rain kept falling, because the rain did not care, and Tio Marsh knelt on the flooded causeway with the blood washing pink off his face, and his hands still bound, and could not, for a moment, make himself get up. He was not hurt badly. The cut over his cheekbone would scar, and nothing else was broken. But he knelt there in the streaming dark with 20 men dead around him and a world unmade at his word, and the calm he had carried for a year cracked, just once, and something raw and human came up through it, because he had built the trap and cut the drainage and spent the piece on purpose, with his eyes open, and knowing a thing must be done and watching it done are not the same weight, and he was not a killer by trade or by nature and never would be. And the difference between a man who protects what's his and a man who enjoys it is the difference that lets you kneel in the rain afterward and feel the whole cost of it land. Then the matron came and put her great gray head against his chest, gently, the way he had first put his hand against hers, and she leaned into him with that weight that could have crushed him, easy as a held breath, and the ember glow in her throat warmed the rain between them, and Tio Marsh put his bound hands up as best he could against the side of her face and stopped being alone with it. Cinder came out of the dark and lay down around the both of them, curling that huge scarred forgelet body between his keeper and the rain and the wreckage, and the Spinehound came and the Delvers, and one by one the shelf that had answered his word came and settled around the soft apex on the flooded causeway, not in triumph, because they did not have triumph, but in the older thing, the thing underneath, the pack closing warm around the one that mattered, keeping him, the way he had kept their young. That was how Alan Pre found him when she finally came down out of the station on shaking legs and crossed the causeway in the rain, and cut the restraints off his wrists with her own manipulators. A bleeding, ordinary, exhausted human sitting in the middle of 40 apex predators of a Category 1 Deathworld. None of them touching him, but all of them near, all of them turned outward against a dark that no longer held anything that could hurt him. "Tio," she said, her voice had stopped shaking. It had gone quiet and certain, the voice of a witness who has seen the thing she will spend the rest of her life telling true. "It's recorded, all of it. The landing, the offer, the crew, the all of it. It's in the light and it's going to stay there." "Good," Tio said. He wiped the rain and the blood from his face with the back of one freed hand. He looked out at the flooded apron, the drowned lander, the quiet. Then he looked at the gray head still resting against his chest, and he put his warm hand on it, and he said the only benediction the moment needed, the same 3 words he'd said to a dying cub on an airlock floor a year and a lifetime ago. "You're all right," he told the whole watching world. "You're all right now." The light came to Threnody 11 days later, and this time it came in the shape Tio had asked for. The research expedition dropped through the cloud in 3 broad-hulled vessels. The funded, witnessed, lawful one Alan's honest report had set in motion before Quen Saravel could bury it, an expedition of xenobiologists and behavioral specialists, and crucially, an appointed observer from the Protected Species Registry with the authority to make a finding stick. They had launched to study a rumor. They arrived to find the rumor confirmed past any argument, a drowned harvest lander still standing in the apron's receding lake, and a xenobehaviorist under sanction sitting on the causeway with a full and time-stamped record of an attempted atrocity, its perpetrators, its paymaster, and its failure. They also arrived to find the thing itself, which no report, however honest, had prepared them for. Dr. Aviath's son, who led the expedition and had spent 40 years cataloging the behavior of dangerous fauna, walked out onto the causeway on the second morning with every intention of maintaining professional distance, and lasted exactly as long as it took the matron to bring a cub to the human. It was a new one, a mother from deep in the ranges, come down with a young vacar whose eye had swollen shut with some infection of the season, and she came onto the causeway past the expedition's stunned ranks as if they were furniture, and she set her cub down in front of Tio, and she waited. And Tio Marsh, with 40 of the most credentialed xenoscientists in the sector watching and recording and forgetting to breathe, did what he did. He warmed his hands over the deck heater. He knelt and wrapped his 3 soft knocks on the plating. He said, "Let me see, then," to a cub whose mother could have deboned the entire expedition in a minute. And the cub let him, and he cleaned and treated the swollen eye while the mother stood over him with her weight canted forward and her throat grinding low. And when it was done, she took her young up in the needle jaw and walked back into the world. Dr. Aviath's son sat down on the wet causeway, quite suddenly, and did not speak for some time. "You understand," she said finally to Tio in a voice gone strange, "that this changes everything. Every model we have of apex behavior, every assumption about the ceiling of cross-species trust. The registry has never, there is no protected species framework that even contemplates." She stopped and gathered herself and did the thing that made Tio decide he could work with her. She stopped talking about frameworks. "How did you do it?" she asked simply. "Truly, how?" "I didn't fight the world," Tio said. "That's all. Everyone they sent here fought the world, and the world always wins that. So I fixed what I found, and I took nothing I didn't need, and I warmed my hands, and I knocked before I came in." He looked out at the tree line. "It took a year. It wasn't a trick and it wasn't a gift. It was just engineering. You find the pieces that want to fit." Alan Pri, standing at his shoulder with her sanctions still live in a system 3 jumps away, watched the finest xenobiologist in the sector write those words down as though they were scripture, and thought that the assembly had sent this man to the loneliest death it could arrange, and that the assembly was, at that very moment, 3 jumps away, beginning to understand what it had actually done. When Saravel understood what he had done about the time the Rendhook Company stopped answering its channels. At first he was not concerned. A harvest crew went quiet during a job. That was normal, that was the point. Deniability ran both ways. He waited for the coded burst that would tell him the hold was full and the caretaker was dead and the world was stripped and his margin was made. He waited 3 days. He waited a week. And then, instead of Harrower Vox coded burst, the thing that came up the channels to Quen Saravel's desk was a formal notice from the Protected Species Registry, and it had his name in it. He read it 4 times, the way he had watched the recording 4 times, and this time he did not smile. The honest report he had spent his credibility burying had not stayed buried. It had gone wide, to places he could not reach, and now it had a lawful expedition standing on it, and an appointed registry observer, and a time-stamped record, Alan Pri's record, the record he had tried to discredit, of a Katai harvest crew landing on a newly protected world, of their commander stating on the record the name of the man who had hired him and why, of an attempted murder of a registered keeper, of an attempted atrocity against a protected apex population. All of it filmed, all of it in the light, all of it leading by a clean, bright thread back to a certain overseer's private ledger. The Rendhook Company was not going to contradict any of it. The Rendhook Company was at the bottom of a receding lake on Threnody, and its silence, which Quen had been counting on, had become the loudest testimony of all. He had built his whole career on being the man who kept his hands clean while other people did the taking. He had cleared the light so the dark could work, and the light he had cleared had simply grown back around a truth too large to shade, and now every clean, deniable layer he had built between himself and Threnody had become, one after another, a step on a very short staircase leading directly to him. They did not arrest Quen Saravel with any drama. The assembly did not do drama. The assembly did paperwork, and the paperwork did to Quen exactly what Quen had spent 30 years doing to other people. He was filed. He was reviewed. His ledger was opened, and the small ongoing considerations of 30 grubby years opened with it, because once the machine decides to look at a man, it does not look at only one thing. The procurement colleague whose favor had sent a troublesome engineer to Threnody in the first place went into the file beside him. So did the contractor with the cousin, whose cut radiation shielding had started the whole chain, and whose name Tio Marsh had put in an honest report a lifetime ago that no one had read. Until now. Until it surfaced in the record as the first link. The thing the whole machine had been protecting when it decided a young engineer with no clan was more convenient dead than heard. Quen Saraval was posted, in the end, to a quiet administrative station at the edge of nothing, stripped of his ledger and his considerations and his careful clean hands, to spend the rest of his service processing other men's paperwork under other men's eyes. It was not a death world. The Assembly had learned that season to be careful about death worlds. But it was an ending, for a man like Quen, nearly as complete as the one the matron had given Harrower Vach, and it had the same shape at its heart, the total, obliterating indifference of a system that had decided he was no longer worth its attention, turning its great head away from him to look at the thing that mattered. The thing that mattered, 3 jumps away, was a tired, ordinary engineer on a flooded causeway with a scar coming up over his cheekbone, warming his hands, who never learned most of these names and would not have cared about them if he had. The registry made Threnody a protected world before the expedition left, and it made Tio Marsh its keeper. Not the Assembly's kind of keeper, the kind you posted somewhere to be forgotten, but the registry's kind, the only living authority on a biosphere the whole field of xenobiology had suddenly and desperately decided it needed to understand without breaking. The formalizing was, to Tio, mostly funny. Dr. Aviath's son's people spent their days documenting his habits with a solemnity he found hard to sit still under. The thing he did with his hands over the heater before he touched a new patient, the thing Alan had named the warm-handed rule on the first afternoon, half in awe and half, Tio had always suspected, in self-defense against how strange the moment became in the expedition's formal findings, the first mandatory contact protocol in the registry's new Threnody framework. There were diagrams. There was a recommended duration. A young specialist Tio liked, an earnest thing named Pell, filed a 40-page appendix on optimal palm temperature that Tio never read and Pell was very proud of. The 3 knocks became doctrine too. The courtesy of 3, Alan had called it gravely, into her recorder a year before, and now it was written into the standing orders that any personnel the registry ever cleared to set foot on Threnody, and there would be few, and they would be chosen with great care, must, before crossing any threshold where the fauna denned, knock 3 times, unhurried on any solid surface to announce themselves. Tio watched a registry lawyer read that clause aloud in a formal review with a completely straight face, this treaty article about knocking, and had to leave the room. "You are laughing," Alan observed, finding him outside. Her sanctions had been vacated the week the finding came down. The registry had not only cleared her but named her the framework's co-author, and there was color back in the way she held herself, the brittleness gone. "I have never seen you laugh." "They wrote down knocking," Tio said. "There's a legal clause about knocking." He shook his head. "A year ago I was a dead man they filed and forgot. Now there's a 40-page appendix about how warm my hands should be. I don't—" He laughed again, tiredly, helplessly. "They keep looking for the trick, the doctrine, the system, and the whole system is, be gentle, be steady, take nothing, and knock so you don't scare anybody. That's it. That's the whole thing. My mother knew it. Every decent person who ever calmed a frightened animal or a frightened kid knew it. It's not a discovery. It's just manners." He wiped his eyes. "But if they need to write it down to protect this place, then let them write it down. Let them call it whatever they want. I'll knock 3 times for the rest of my life and they can put a diagram next to it." Alan looked at him for a while, this ordinary tired man the machine had thrown away, around whom an entire new science was assembling itself like the shelf assembling in the dark. "They will call it after you in the end," she said. "The framework. Whatever they name it, it will be your name to the people who use it. 50 years from now, there will be keepers on a dozen worlds warming their hands and knocking 3 times, and not one of them will know they are doing a thing a discarded engineer worked out alone in the rain because he refused to die the way he was told to. She paused. Does that trouble you? Tio thought about it, honestly, the way he thought about everything. No, he said, as long as it works, that's all engineering ever wanted, not credit, just for the thing to hold. He looked out at the tree line where a young glider was learning to fly in tight, clean circuits above the causeway, its wings straight, its crooked start a year and a lifetime behind it. Let it hold, he said quietly. That's enough. They offered to take him home, of course. That was the part everyone expected him to want. The registry could have him reassigned anywhere. The sanctions the assembly had hung on his file were vacated in the same review that buried Quensaravel, and there was a whole civilization 3 jumps away that had suddenly discovered it owed a debt to a man it had tried to quietly kill. Dr. Aviath's son put it to him plainly on the last morning of the expedition, standing at the head of the causeway with the vessels loading behind her. He was famous now, in the small serious way that mattered in her field. He could have a chair at any institute in the sector. He could write the framework from a warm, dry office and never feel Threnodi's rain again. He had earned, if anyone ever had, the right to go home. This is home, Tio said. He said it without weight, the way he said everything, but Aviath's son had spent enough time with him now to hear what was under it, and she did not argue. She looked past him at the den, at the warm-lit mouth of it, at Cinder lying across the causeway grown huge and scarred in content with the ember glow banked low in his throat, at the gray matron drowsing beside her son with the years heavy on her plating now, at the whole strange court that had assembled around one ordinary man on a world that was supposed to have eaten him. Yes, she said. I can see that it is. And she left him there, and the vessels climbed away into the cloud, and the light they had brought stayed behind them, written into a framework and a finding and a record kept forever in the open, and Tio Marsh went back to work. He never really left again. He would go up the well now and then in the years that followed, when the registry needed him to stand in front of a review or teach a class of hand-picked keepers-to-be, the thing that could not really be taught, only shown, how to warm your hands, how to knock, how to fix what you find and take nothing you don't need, how to stop fighting a world long enough to let it show you what it is. He was, by every account of the people who met him in those rooms, a plain and tired and unimpressive man, poorly suited to a lecture hall, who came alive only when he talked about the world he'd left below. And then he would go back to Threnody always, on the first berth he could get, back to the rain and the tree line and the warm den and the pack, because a man who has been recognized by an entire world as the strength above its strength does not find much to keep him in a warm, dry office 3 jumps away. The gray matron died in the 4th spring, of nothing but her years, and Tio Marsh was with her when she went. He had known it was coming the way he knew the weather. She had been slowing for a season, the great gray body stiff in the mornings, the ember glow banking lower, the long hunts given over to Cinder and the younger ones, while she kept to the causeway and the warm den floor he had built. She had come to Threnodi's edge an old apex the first night she walked into his airlock with a dying cub in her jaws, and she had spent her last years as something no Vakar had ever been, which was safe and cared for and known. He did for her, at the end, the only thing left to do, which was the thing she had first come to him unable to do for her own young. He stayed. He did not walk away. On the last night he sat on the warm den floor with her enormous head in his lap, and he warmed his hands, and he rapped his 3 soft knocks on the plating one more time. This is me, I'm here. And he told the old gray matron of the northern shelf that she was all right, that she'd done well, that she could put it down now, and the ember glow in her throat rose once, slow, and fell, and did not rise again. He grieved her the way he did everything, quietly and with his hands, and he buried her, because he had taught this world, among the other things, that its dead could be kept, and not only walked away from, under a cairn of ballast stone at the head of the causeway, near the smaller, older cairn he had raised in his first month for the third dead keeper he'd never met. It seemed right to him that they lie near each other, the human the world had killed and the apex who had ended the killing, the two ends of the thing he had spent his life bridging. Cinder sat the whole vigil beside him, and when it was done, the great forgelet beast who had come to him, a dying cub the size of a dog and grown to top his mother by a head, the beast whose reset joint had held for 4 years of hunting, lifted his vast scarred head and made the three-part call down the shelf, across the floodplain, into the ranges, the call his mother had made the morning Tio first fed him from a flat palm. And the shelf answered it near and far, the way it had answered her, and Tio understood that he was hearing a thing handed down. The mantle passing, the old matron's word becoming the new matron's word, and the new matron was the cub he had saved, and the cub he had saved was telling the whole world the thing his mother had told it 4 springs ago. The soft one keeps us, we keep the soft one it holds. The years after that were the good years, the ones Tio would not have traded for any chair at any institute in the sector, and they were good precisely because they were not remarkable, because the extraordinary thing he had made had become, on Threnody, ordinary. The predators still brought him their young. That never changed and never would. It was the law of the world now, the new law, written under the old one the way he had written the drainage channels under the floods. But it changed in shape as the sanctuary grew. The registry, working from the framework Alan and Aviath's son had built on his habits, brought keepers to Threnody, a few, chosen with great care, the gentle, patient, unremarkable kind of person the field had learned to look for after Tio, the kind nobody had ever thought to value before a discarded engineer proved what such a person could hold. He trained them himself. He taught them to warm their hands and to knock 3 times and to fix what they found and take nothing they didn't need, and he watched them fail and flinch and learn, and he watched the ones with the right stubborn gentleness in them earn, slowly, over seasons, the thing that could not be given, only earned. A mother coming out of the tree line to set a sick cub down at their feet and wait. The first time Tio watched one of his keepers, young Pell, of the 40-page appendix, who had turned out to have exactly the right kind of patient hands under all that eagerness, receive a cub from a wary spinehound mother and mend it and give it back, he stood at the den mouth and felt something he had no engineer's word for. He had built a thing that would outlast him. Not a station, not a framework, not a wall of skulls. A way of being that the world would keep teaching, keeper to keeper, cub to cub, long after the man who first knocked 3 times in the rain was gone. And the world was known now in the light, the way he had insisted from the first dark causeway. Ships came to Threnody that did not come to take registry vessels, study teams once memorably, a full delegation of assembly officials who had to be shown formally on the record, the thing their own machine had tried to bury, so that the finding could be entered into law at the highest level, and the world made permanently, unassailably safe. Tio did not much want the delegation there. But he understood better than anyone the value of a witness, so he let them come, and he showed them what Threnody was. Not all of what the years brought was grave, and Tio was glad of that too, because a place that is only ever solemn is a place that has forgotten why it is worth protecting. There was the season the spinehounds discovered his coffee. He had taken in his tired evenings to setting a battered tin cup of the recycled stuff on the flat rail outside the den mouth to cool, and one dusk a lean quilled adolescent, a grandpup of the very first pup he had cleared an obstruction from, years gone, stole it clean off the rail and drank the whole thing and spent half the night vibrating through the tree line like a struck wire. After that the spinehounds could not be kept from the cup. They did not want it for the warmth or the water, they wanted it because their keeper had it, and on Threnody the keeper's habits were, to the shelf, a kind of law. Dr. Aviath's son's people documented the whole business with the crushing seriousness of their trade, filed a monograph on resource mimicry as social bonding in Threnody fauna, and named the behavior gravely in the standing record, the shared cup. Tio read the title of the monograph and thought about a pack of apex-adjacent predators fighting over a tin mug of bad coffee because the soft one drank it, and laughed until his ribs hurt. And then, because he was who he was, he started leaving a second cup out on the rail on purpose, cooled and safe, so nobody had to steal anything, and the shelf took that too and made it ritual. And somewhere in a registry archive, 3 jumps away, there is a legal appendix about the correct evening placement of a keeper's cup. There was the young glider who learned to mimic his whistle. Not a call it had, but his, the tuneless 3-note thing he did without noticing while he worked, and taught it to the next generation of gliders, so that on still evenings the canopy above the causeway would answer his idle whistling with his own notes given back, off-key, from a dozen membranes wheeling in the dusk, until the whole tree line was full of the sound of a discarded engineer's absent-minded habit, sung back to him by a species that had adopted it the way children adopt a parent's turn of phrase. Alan caught it once on her gear and could not, for professional reasons, explain in her filing why she had let it run for 11 unbroken minutes and did not try. Some things you keep in the light simply because they are worth keeping. These were the small, warm proofs, and Tio treasured them more than the grave ones, because they were the ones that showed the thing had gone all the way down, that the shelf did not merely tolerate him or use him or even only trust him, but loved him in the plain, unremarkable daily way a family loves, the way that steals your coffee and sings your bad songs back at you and lies across your door at night. And that was worth more, he thought, than any finding in any highest law. The delegation came down in a gleaming assembly barge with the sigils of a dozen high offices on its hull, and its passengers walked out onto the causeway in their formal plating and their status robes expecting, Tio could tell, a ceremony, a demonstration, a controlled and dignified thing they could enter into the record and fly away from. They had read the framework. They had read the findings. They believed they had understood, in the way officials believe they have understood a thing they have only read. They understood nothing until Cinder came. He came at Tio's low word, out of the tree line, the new matron of the northern shelf in the fullness of his strength, 3 meters at the shoulder now, bigger by half than his mother had ever been, his stone gray plating a map of old hunts, the ember glow in his throat a steady forge light that threw the delegation's shadows long across the wet grating. The officials broke ranks. A high syndic in silver robes made a sound no syndic is ever supposed to make and stumbled back into the ones behind him. 2 of the honor guard went for their sidearms and Tio said, "Sharp, hands," and they froze. And he said it again, gentler to Cinder, "Easy," and the great beast eased. And the whole delegation stood pinned in a terror they had flown 3 jumps to feel superior to. And then Cinder did the thing that made it into the formal record, the thing that turned a demonstration into a founding. He was carrying something. The delegation had been too busy being afraid to see it. He crossed the causeway to Tio through the frozen officials as if they were furniture, the same walk his mother had, that total apex indifference to anything that was not the one that mattered, and he lowered his vast head, careful, careful, and set down at Tio's feet the thing he had carried in the needle jaw. A cub, his own this time. A Vakar cub the size of a large dog, soft-plated and dull clay-colored, breathing wrong, one small limb held gingerly off the ground. The new matron of Threnody had a hurt cub, and he had carried it, past a delegation of the highest officials of the civilization that had tried to strip his world, straight to the soft, clawless keeper, and set it down and stepped back and waited to be shown. The way his mother had shown him it was done, on an airlock floor, in a storm, 5 springs, and a whole changed world ago. Tio Marsh knelt on the wet causeway in front of the most powerful people in the sector, and did not look at a single one of them. He warmed his hands over the little glow bar he still kept by the den mouth for exactly this. He rapped his 3 soft knocks on the plating. He said, "Let me see then, little one," to the great new matron's hurt cub, and the cub let him, and he set the small joint and splinted it with a piece the size of a matchstick and a patience 5 years had only deepened. while a 3-meter apex predator stood over him with its weight canted forward and its throat grinding low, and 40 high officials of the Tessellate Assembly watched, forgotten, unable to speak. The single most important thing any of them would ever witness happened 4 feet away, and entirely without them. When it was done, Cinder took his young up in his jaws, careful of the splint, and leaned once against his keeper's chest with a weight that could have flattened the barge, gentle as a held breath, and walked back into the world. Tio stood and wiped his hands and turned at last to the delegation, and found them all staring at him, the syndics, the guard, the high offices in their silver robes, with the exact expression he had seen on Alan Pree's face the first night, on Aviath's sons, on every alien who had ever stood on this causeway and watched the world lie down for the ordinary man in the middle of it. Shock. Awe. And under both, dawning and total, the thing he had spent a year in the rain earning and the rest of his life quietly wearing. The recognition that they were, all of them, in the presence of an apex, and that it wore a plain, tired face and warm hands, and that it had been theirs to throw away, and they had thrown it, and the world it landed on had known its worth before they ever did. You wanted a demonstration, Tio said. He was not gloating, he did not have it in him and did not need it. He only sounded tired and certain. That's not a demonstration, that's just Tuesday. That's what this place is every day, whether you're here to see it or not. He looked out at the tree line, where Cinder's emberglow was already fading into the dark with the cub safe in his jaws. You sent me here to die quietly so you wouldn't have to look at what you'd done. Instead, I lived, and a whole world learned something your whole civilization never did, and now you're going to have to write it into your highest law, and your names are going to be on it forever as the people who tried to sell it by the pound. He picked up his glow bar. Warm your hands on the way out. It's the polite thing here. This world remembers who's gentle. And he walked back into the den and left the most powerful people in the sector standing in the rain, learning the one lesson Threnody taught everyone who came to it sooner or later, which was that all their power stopped at the tree line, and something older and truer took over there, and it had already made its choice. The finding went into the highest law, exactly as Tio had said it would, and the names of the officials who had tried to bury it went in beside it, and that would have been ending enough. But the thing Tio Marsh had worked out alone in the rain did not stay on Threnody, because ideas that are true do not stay anywhere, and the Assembly had a great many Deathworlds, and it had spent a great many years posting its inconvenient people to them to be quietly forgotten. Alan Pree made it her life's work to find them. She had the standing now. The framework had made her, of all the things a xenobehaviorist could become, an authority the machine could not simply file away. And she used it for one purpose above all others, the purpose that had found her on a dark causeway 42 dead postings into a career of writing honest lines nobody read. She went looking, world by world, posting by posting, for the ones the Assembly had thrown away. Most of them were already gone. The machine had been efficient in its quiet cruelty for a long time, and the Deathworlds had done the work they were assigned. But not all of them were gone. Here and there, on worlds catalogued as closed, Alan Pree found a light still burning, a discarded person who, like Tio, had refused to die the way they were told to, who had stopped fighting their world long enough to learn it, who had fixed what they found and taken nothing they didn't need, and who had, alone and unwitnessed and certain they were the only such fool in the galaxy, begun to earn the trust of something that should have killed them. She brought them the framework. She brought them the one thing Tio had never had in his first terrible year, which was the knowledge that it could be done, that they were not mad, that the strange thing happening to them had a shape and a name and a whole science now standing behind it. And she brought them, when they wanted it, the thing that mattered more than any framework, a witness, to keep their truth in the light before some other Quen Saravel could sell it in the dark. There were 9 of them in the end that Alan found alive, 9 discarded people on 9 Deathworlds, each of whom had, in their own way, in their own weather, worked out the same impossible thing. 9 ordinary thrown-away souls whom the machine had judged more convenient dead than heard, and whom 9 lethal worlds had judged instead to be the strength above their strength. The assembly had built a machine for turning its inconvenient people into quiet corpses on the edge of the map. And the edge of the map had looked at those people, one after another, and disagreed. Tio met a few of them in the years that followed at the rare gatherings the registry held. He found he did not have much to say to them, and did not need to. They knew each other on sight, the keepers, the way the shelf had known him, not by anything spoken, but by the thing underneath it, the warm hands and the patient stillness and the refusal, bone deep, to take. They would stand together at the edge of some registry function in their plain clothes, uncomfortable in the warm, dry rooms, and say almost nothing, and understand each other completely, and then go home, each of them, to the worlds that had chosen them, back to the rain and the tree line and the young that were always still being brought. There was a night, years on, that Tio Marsh came to think of as the one that closed the circle, though he never told anyone that, because it would have sounded like more than it was, and he distrusted anything that sounded like more than it was. A storm had been screaming against the relay for 6 hours, a true wet season deluge, the kind he had learned to read like a friend's moods, the rain coming down in ropes and the drainage channels running silver and the whole northern shelf gone to weather. He was older now. The scar over his cheekbone had faded to a thin, pale line, and there were others to keep it company, and his hands were slower than they had been, though no less warm. He was working late in the den, alone but for the pack, mending a piece of the heat line under the deck plating that had never given him trouble in 20 years and had chosen tonight to fail. And he felt the thing he had felt on this exact night 20 years before, the change in air pressure behind his ears, the weight, the stillness, the sudden absence of the small night things. He set down the torque driver without hurrying, and he turned, both hands open and empty, and there was a creature in the airlock he had never seen before. It was young, and it was hurt, and it was alone. Some ranging thing from deep in the world, a species that denned far from the shelf and rarely came near the station, its kind not among the ones the matron had told all those springs ago. Its mother was not with it. It had come alone through the storm, dragging a ruined leg, following. He understood this the way he understood whether now, not a call it had been given but a rumor its whole world carried in its bones by now, the thing every living thing on Threnody knew the way it knew where the water ran, that there was a place, and a soft apex who kept it, where the young were made whole. It had come by itself, across a Deathworld, in a storm, because the world had told it where to go. "Easy," Tio said to the frightened, hurt young thing in his airlock, in the same level voice he'd used on a dying Vakar cub 20 years and a whole changed world ago. "I'm not going anywhere. Let me see." And he crossed to the heater, slow hands where the young thing could see them. He warmed his palms until the cold came out of them. He knelt, his old knees complaining, and he rapped his 3 soft knocks on the deck plating. "I'm here. I'm coming. This is me." And the hurt young thing's head came up at the sound, at the courtesy, at the thing its world had promised it would find, and it let the soft, clawless apex put warm hands on its ruined leg, and Tio Marsh, keeper of Threnody, got to work. Cinder watched from the den mouth, vast and gray and forgelit, the old cub who was old himself now, the matron of the northern shelf for 2 decades, and he did not stir, because his keeper had it, because this was allowed, because it was only what the world did now, every day, whether anyone was there to see it or not. No one ever tried to harvest Threnody again, and it was not because the law forbade it, though the law did. It was because of what happened to the ones who had tried, and because the story of it, the drowned lander, the swallowed crew, the apex who turned her head away from the great harrower Vok as though he were weather, had gone out into the low channels the way stories do, and had become, in the retelling, the one thing more effective than any law, a thing that frightened the kind of people the law could not. But the shelf did not rely on the story, because the shelf did not know the story. The shelf knew only its keeper and the young and the law under the law, and its protection never once slept. Tio saw it proven, quietly, 100 times over the years, in ways that never made a record. He saw it the day a careless registry pilot, new and eager and badly briefed, brought a survey skimmer down too fast and too loud over the tree line where the young denned, and the whole shelf came off the ground in a single silent instant, 40 apex predators rising out of the flood channels, and the high rock in the streaming dark, the ember glow blazing up in 100 throats, the world one heartbeat from answering a threat it had not yet decided was real. Tio had walked out onto the causeway with his old slow steps and his warm hands raised and said, "Easy, easy, friend. That one's just a fool, not a hunter." And the shelf had held on his word, the way it always held, and settled back into the dark. And the pilot never knew how close he had come to learning the difference the hard way, and Tio never told him, because the boy would knock 3 times for the rest of his career, and that was lesson enough. That was the thing the officials in their silver robes never fully grasped, the thing that could not be written into any framework. The gentleness and the lethality were not two things. They were one thing, seen from two sides. The same recognition that made a 3-meter apex lean against Tio's chest gentle as a held breath was the recognition that would, without hesitation and without mercy, unmake anything that came for the young, because to the shelf they were the same act, the keeping and the killing, the two faces of the one law the soft apex had taught them, which was that the young were safe here, and that safe was a thing you built with warm hands and defended with everything you had, and that there was no contradiction in it at all. And never had been. The assembly had sent a gentle man to a lethal world to be killed. The lethal world had looked at the gentle man and recognized, faster and more truly than the assembly ever could, that gentleness and lethality had always been the same strength, and that here at last was a creature who understood how to hold both, and it had given him its young to prove it. Alan Pree wrote a great many papers over the course of the career that a dark causeway on Threnody had given back to her, but the one she was proudest of was not a paper at all. It was a single paragraph, tucked into the introduction of the standing framework, that the registry had tried 3 times to edit out for being unscientific, and that she had refused 3 times to remove. Every intelligent species we have catalogued, she had written, meets a predator and asks the same question: how do I defeat it or flee it or master it? We build the wall, the weapon, the cage. We treat the teeth as the problem to be solved. The human Marsh asked a different question, and it is the question that changed the science, and it is a question no other species in the record thought to ask. He did not ask how to defeat the predator or flee it or master it. He asked what it needed, and whether he could give it without being diminished, and whether a thing with teeth might be, underneath the teeth, exactly as afraid and as loyal and as capable of love as anything else that raises young in a hard world. He was, in the end, correct. We had spent our whole history armoring ourselves against the teeth. It took a discarded human, thrown to a world to die, to walk up to the teeth and warm his hands and ask what was wrong. That is the entire discovery. Everything else in this framework is a footnote to it. She read it aloud to Tio once, on a visit to Threnody in his later years, sitting on the causeway in the good light after a storm with the cairns at the head of it, and Cinder drowsing gray and enormous in the warm and the young of a dozen species moving easy through the tree line, and she asked him if he thought it was true. Tio was quiet for a while, in the way she had long ago stopped mistaking for having nothing to say. "I think," he said finally, "that everybody I ever knew who was any good was somebody who'd learned that the scariest thing in the room is usually just the most frightened one. My mother knew it. She wasn't a scientist. She just knew it in her hands." He looked out at the tree line. "The world didn't choose me because I was special, Alan. It chose me because I was the first one they sent who bothered to ask. That's the part I hope you keep in the record. Not that a human did something no one else could. That a human did something anyone could have done, and almost nobody does, and it turned out to matter more than all the walls we ever built." He turned his old face to her, and there was the ghost of that rare tired smile on it. That's the whole of it if you want it in one line. Not that we're the strongest thing in the dark, that we were the ones willing to warm our hands. T.O. Marsh grew old on Threnody, and it was, by any measure the Assembly had ever used to judge a life, an unimportant one. He never held a chair or a title beyond keeper. He never grew rich. He never wanted to, and the registry stipend went mostly to the station and the young. He never married, never had children of the kind the Assembly counted, never built anything that would carry his name in bronze. He remained, to the end, exactly what he had appeared to be to Harrower Vach on a flooded apron long ago. A plain, tired, unremarkable man, smaller than the story, poorly suited to lecture halls, good with his hands and stubborn past all sense. If you had passed him in a corridor 3 jumps away, you would not have looked twice. That was the truth of him, and it was the whole point of him, and he had made his peace with it a long time before the world did. But down below the cloud, on a world the catalog still listed by a string of numbers no one used anymore, T.O. Marsh was the most important thing that had ever happened, and everything with teeth for 100 kilometers knew it. He trained keepers until his hands could no longer set a splint, and then he trained them to train keepers. He wrote nothing down that Alun and Aviath's son had not already written better, and he was glad of it. He had never trusted words the way he trusted the thing itself, the warm hand, the 3 knocks, the low, even voice. In his last years, he mostly sat at the den mouth in the good light after the storms. Wrapped against a cold, his old blood felt more sharply now, and he watched the work go on without him. Pell grown gray himself now, mending a spinehound pup, a young keeper he'd trained from her first flinching season, receiving a cub from a wary ranging mother and giving it back whole. The young of a dozen species moving easy through a tree line that had, within living memory, been the edge of a killing ground, and was now the safest place for a small hurt thing to be born on any world in the sector. And the pack kept him, at the end, the way he had kept them at the beginning. Cinder was old too, by then the great gray matron of 2 decades, his hunts long given over to his own grown young, his forge light banked low, his plating a map of a lifetime's seasons. But he had never once left in all those years, since the season his keeper bled on a causeway and the world came off the leash. He lay across the den mouth at night with his chin on his forelegs and his 4 eyes half-lidded and open, exactly as his mother had, and when T.O. came out in the dark with his old slow steps to sit in the good cold air, Cinder would rumble once, "Lo, I have him," and T.O. would put his warm hand on the huge gray head and say, "I know." "Me too," the way he had for 20 years, and they would sit together, the discarded man and the saved cub, the 2 ends of the bridge, and watch the world they had made hold in the dark. He died in the den, in the warm, with the pack around him, which was more than the Assembly had ever meant to leave him, and exactly what the world had decided he was owed. It was quiet at the end, and it was not lonely, and those were the 2 things that mattered most to the people who loved him, because the Assembly had reached across the whole galaxy to make his death loud with fear and empty of any witness, and the world had answered by making it the opposite of both. Alun Pre was there, old herself now, holding one of his slow, warm hands in her manipulators. Pell was there, gray and steady, the keeper he had made. And Cinder was there, the great gray matron laid full length along the warm den floor with his enormous head close, the emberglow banked to almost nothing, and when T.O.'s breathing found the bottom of a last real breath and let it out slow and did not draw another, it was Cinder who made the sound, not a roar, not the grinding grief his mother had carried into an airlock a lifetime ago with a dying cub in her jaws, but the low 3-part call, the one that meant a thing had passed and the world should know it. He raised his old gray head, the cub who had been the size of a dog and had grown to top his mother by half, and he sent the call out through the open den mouth and across the causeway and into the streaming dark of the tree line, down the shelf, across the floodplain, into the ranges where the young of a dozen species denned safe because of one man's warm hands. And the whole world answered it, near and far, 100 throats taking up the call and passing it on. So that for one long moment, the entire northern shelf of Threnody rang with the sound of a world telling itself that its keeper was gone. They buried him at the head of the causeway, under a cairn of ballast stone, between the small old cairn of the third dead keeper he had never met and the great gray cairn of the matron who had chosen him. It seemed right to the people who did it that he lie there among them, the human the world had killed, the human the world had saved, the apex who had ended the killing, the three of them together at the mouth of the place where all of it had begun, in the rain, with a dying cub set down between a stranger's boots. The work did not stop when he did. That was the truest measure of what he had built, and it was the measure he would have cared about most. That Threnody did not need Tio Marsh anymore, because Tio Marsh had made sure of it. Pell kept the den, and trained the ones who came after Pell, and the young of a dozen species went on being carried out of the storm to warm hands and 3 soft knocks, season after season, long after anyone on the causeway had met the man who first knelt in the rain and asked a dying thing what was wrong. Cinder held the shelf for another 6 springs, the last of the pack who had known Tio alive, and when the old gray matron finally lay down at the head of the causeway near the cairns and did not rise, one of his own grown young took up the 3-part call, and the mantle passed again, keeper to keeper below and matron to matron above, the 2 lines running side by side down the years exactly as the man and the beast had first run them, and neither line ever broke. Off Threnody, the thing spread the way Tio had told Alan it would, because it was true and true things do not stay put. The 9 keepers Alan Pre had found alive on 9 Deathworlds became 90, and then more, as the registry stopped writing worlds off and started, cautiously, world by world, sending gentle, patient, unremarkable people to them instead of throwing inconvenient ones at them to die. The Assembly never quite admitted, in any formal document, that it had spent generations murdering its own troublesome souls by posting. The Assembly did not do admissions any more than it did drama. But the practice ended, quietly, the way such things end when the machine finds a use for its victims that is worth more than their silence. And if the machine's motives were as grubby as they had ever been, the outcome, for once, was not. Deathworlds became sanctuaries. The thrown-away became keepers. And a great many small hurt things across a great many lethal worlds went on being made whole by hands that had been sent there once to be stilled. They did name the framework after him, in the end, the way Alan had promised. Not officially. Officially it carried a string of registry codes as dry as the old catalog number for Threnody itself. But the keepers who used it, the ones who warmed their hands and knocked 3 times and fixed what they found and took nothing they didn't need, they called it the keeper's way. And when a young one asked why, an old one would tell them about a man the Assembly had thrown to a deathworld to die, who had refused, and had asked a monster what was wrong instead of how to kill it, and had been answered by a whole world laying its children at his feet. Most of the young ones did not believe it the first time they heard it. Then they served a season, and warmed their hands and knelt in the rain, and felt a wary mother watch them mend her young and walk away and leave it in their care. And they believed it after that, the way you believe a burn, once and forever. There is a keeper on Threnody now who never knew Tio Marsh, and never will, and does the whole of his work without knowing most of his name. She is young, younger than he was when the hauler dropped him at Meridian, and the pilot told him not to go outside at night. She came the way keepers come now, chosen for the gentle, stubborn thing in her that the registry has finally learned to see and value, trained through her flinching seasons by an old keeper who was trained by an old keeper who was trained by Pell, who was trained by the man himself. She has read the keeper's way. She has warmed her hands 10,000 times. She knows the 3 knocks in her bones the way she knows her own heartbeat, and she could not tell you, if you asked, exactly where she learned that cold hands mean carrion on this world, and no living thing wants to be touched by carrion. She only knows it, the way the whole shelf knows where the water runs. She was working late in the den on a night the storm had been screaming against the relay for 6 hours. The true wet season deluge, the rain in ropes, the channels running silver, the shelf gone to weather. When she felt the change in the air behind her ears, the weight, the stillness, the sudden absence of the small night things. She set down her tool without hurrying because she had been taught, through a line of teachers running back to a dead man's warm hands, that hurrying is how the frightened die. She turned, both hands open and empty. There was an apex predator in the airlock, filling the inner hatch, taller at the shoulder than she stood on her feet, slate-tan-dash and gray with years. The emberglow banked low in its throat, one of Cinder's line, though she had no way to know that, the great-grandchild of a cub set down between a stranger's boots 4 generations gone. In its needle jaw it carried something carefully. A cub, soft-plated, dull clay-colored, breathing wrong, one small limb held gingerly off the ground. The keeper, who never knew Tio Marsh, did not reach for the cub. She crossed to the heater first, slow hands where the great beast could see them, and she warmed her palms until the cold came out of them, and she knelt, and she rapped her 3 soft knocks on the deck plating. I'm here. I'm coming. This is me. And the cub's head came up at the sound, at the courtesy, at the promise its whole world carried in its bones. And the apex predator of a Category 1 Deathworld, the deadliest thing in the catalog, watched a soft, clawless human warm her hands over a glow bar and knock her small courtesy on the floor, and it lowered its great gray head, and it set its hurt young down between her boots, and it stepped back, and it waited to be shown the thing its kind had learned 4 generations ago and never once forgotten. Easy, the young keeper said in a level voice to the frightened hurt thing in front of her. I'm not going anywhere. Let me see. That is how the story is told now, in the places that tell it, and there are more of those places every year, because it is the kind of story a hard galaxy discovers it needs. It gets told wrong as often as right, the way true stories do once they outlive the people in them. In some tellings Tio Marsh is a giant, a hero with a jaw like a cliff, striding among monsters that bow to his greatness. Those tellings miss the whole of it, and the keepers who know better wince at them, because the entire point of the man was that there was nothing giant about him at all. He was small, and tired, and ordinary, and afraid at first like anyone, and the world did not choose him for his greatness. The world chose him because he was gentle when gentleness cost him something, and steady when steadiness was harder than fear, and because he looked at the deadliest thing on a Deathworld and asked it what was wrong instead of how to kill it, and any of us could do that, which is the part that matters, and almost none of us do, which is the part that breaks your heart. The Assembly's part in it gets told too, and the Assembly cannot stop it, though generations of syndics have wished they could. It is in the highest law now, unerasable, the finding that a civilization tried to murder its own gentlest souls by throwing them to lethal worlds, and that the lethal worlds looked at those souls and disagreed. The names of the officials who tried to sell Threnody by the pound are in that record, beside the name of the overseer who cleared the light so the dark could work, beside the name of the harvester whose legend ended in a dismissal, and none of those names are remembered for anything else, and all of them are remembered for that. It is the closest thing to justice the machine ever managed, and it managed it by accident, and only because one discarded man had insisted, on a dark causeway, that whatever came for him, he wanted it in the light. And the deepest part of it, the part the keepers keep truest, is the thing Alan Pre put in that stubborn, unscientific paragraph, and defended 3 times against the editors, that the whole galaxy had spent its whole history armoring itself against the teeth, building the wall and the weapon and the cage, treating every predator as a problem to be solved by being stronger or faster or more afraid, and that it took a human thrown away to die to walk up to the teeth and warm his hands and ask. Not because humans are the strongest thing in the dark. They are not, and Tio would have been the first and flattest to say so. The matron could have taken his head between one word and the next, and he knew it every day, and it never once frightened him after the first night, because he had understood something the strong so rarely understand. That the scariest thing in the room is usually just the most frightened one. That a thing with teeth can be, underneath the teeth, exactly as afraid and as loyal and as capable of love as anything else that raises its young in a hard world. That gentleness and lethality were never two things, but one strength seen from two sides, and that a creature who could hold both, and knew which one to lead with, would never lack for a pack again. The assembly meant to kill the human engineer. It chose the lethal world with care, and the loneliest posting it had, and it filed him closed before the hauler ever set him down, and it forgot his name inside the hour. And the lethal world it chose to be, his executioner took one long season to watch the soft, clawless thing that mended what it found and took nothing it didn't need. And then it made its own finding, faster and truer than the assembly ever could. That here at last was the strength above its strength. And it did the only thing a world like that knows how to do with a thing it has recognized. It brought him its young. On Threnody, in the warm den, on a night the storm has been screaming for 6 hours, the young keeper who never knew Tio Marsh gets her warm hands under a hurt cub and goes to work. She sets the small joint the way the line of her teachers set it, running back through Pell and the ones before Pell to a dead man's patient hands. She splints it with a piece the size of a matchstick. She cleans what needs cleaning and takes nothing she doesn't need. And the whole time the great gray apex predator stands over her with its weight canted forward and its throat grinding low, the ember glow banked to a coal, watching a soft, clawless human do the one thing its roaring world has never learned to do for itself. When it is done, the cub, shaking, whole, puts weight on the splinted joint and the joint holds, and the wheeze goes out of its breathing, and it looks up at the keeper with eyes that do not yet know to be afraid of anything. The great beast lowers its head. It takes its young up in the needle jaw, careful of the splint, and it leans once against the keeper's chest, that mountain of killing weight, gentle as a held breath, and then it turns and walks back out into the streaming dark, toward the tree line, toward the shelf, toward a world where it is the law and no cage has ever been, carrying its healed child home. The keeper sits back on her heels in the warm and lets out a breath she did not know she was holding. Outside, the rain comes down in ropes on the cairns at the head of the causeway, 3 of them now weathered almost to the ground, and a 4th beside them, and more beyond that, a whole quiet line of keepers and the beasts who chose them, running back to the rain where all of it began. She does not know most of their names. She does not need to. She knows the work, and the work is the only monument any of them ever wanted. She warms her hands again, out of habit, out of courtesy, out of a thing 4 generations deep in her now that is past habit and past courtesy and has become, simply, who she is. And somewhere out in the black tree line that once watched keepers die and now watches over them, something with teeth is already carrying another hurt young thing toward the only place on a death world where a small broken creature is safe. Following not a command it was given, but a truth its whole world holds in its bones. The truth, a discarded man taught a lethal world one warm-handed night at a time, until the world could not forget it, and would not let it die. They meant to kill him. They chose the deadliest world they had, and they left him on it alone, and they sealed the file and forgot his name. And the deadliest world they had looked at the gentle thing they sent to die, and knew it for what it was, and laid its children at his feet. And it has been bringing him its young, keeper after keeper, cub after cub, ever since, and it always will, because some things a world learns it never unlearns, and the strongest of them all is this: that the hand which mends is stronger than the hand which takes, and that the gentlest thing in the dark, when it finally stops being afraid, is the most terrible and the most beloved of all. Warm your hands, knock 3 times, take nothing you don't need. The pack is waiting, and the young are coming, and on Threnody the light stays on.